They are ghosts on the battlefield, flickering in and out of the freezing mist like bad memories. Their skin a canvas of swirling indigo patterns that seem to move even when they are standing still. You are a Roman auxiliary, shivering in your chainmail at the very edge of the known world, and you aren't looking at an army so much as a hallucination, a screaming, chaotic tide of warriors who wear the winter storms like a cloak and treat the biting wind as an old friend. They do not march in the orderly, rhythmic stomp of the legions, but flow like water over the heather, their weapons catching the dull grey light, their faces obscured by the terrifying, intricate designs that gave them their name. I'm glad you're here, wishing you peace, rest, and maybe a little historical inspiration before sleep. Take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Also, go ahead and post your location and local time in the comments. I love seeing how far these stories travel around the globe. To understand the Picts, we have to start by admitting that we are looking at them through a very distorted lens, usually held by a terrified Roman scribe who probably never got closer to Scotland than a heated villa in southern Gaul. The very name Pict is a bit of a branding exercise, a label slapped onto a diverse group of people by an empire that needed a simple way to categorize the terrifying things living north of the wall. The first recorded use of the term Picti appears in a panegyric, basically a glorified hype speech, by a Roman writer named Eumenius in 297 AD. He calls them the painted ones, or tattooed ones, distinguishing them from the other Britons living further south, who had, by that point, started wearing togas and enjoying the comforts of underfloor heating. But these northern tribes had been there long before Rome decided they needed a catchy nickname. They were the indigenous Iron Age inhabitants of what is now eastern and northern Scotland, a land of deep, brooding lochs, jagged coastlines, and mountains that seemed to scrape the underbelly of the sky. To the Romans, who were used to the sunny, predictable geometry of the Mediterranean, this landscape was essentially another planet. It was wet, it was dark, and it was filled with people who refused to play by the rules of civilized warfare. The central mystery of the Picts, the thing that keeps archaeologists arguing in pubs until closing time, is the nature of that paint. Were they really blue? The traditional story, passed down through centuries of folklore and Mel Gibson movies, is that they dyed themselves with woad. Woad is a plant, Isatis tinctoria, a member of the cabbage family that, when processed correctly, yields a blue dye. But here is the snag in the tapestry. Woad is a terrible tattoo ink. It's caustic. If you try to tattoo woad into the skin, the body rejects it violently, pushing it out as the wound heals. So, if they were tattooing themselves with intricate designs of beasts, crescents, and V-rods, they were likely using copper or iron-based pigments, or perhaps soot, pricked into the skin with bone needles or bronze awls. If it was woad, it was likely surface paint, a temporary war mask applied before battle to terrify the enemy, and perhaps invoke the protection of their gods. Imagine the psychological impact of that. You are a legionary who has marched 1,000 miles from the olive groves of Italy. You are tired, your boots are leaking, and suddenly 1,000 men charge at you, naked or semi-naked in the freezing sleet, their bodies turning blue in the cold. covered in swirling designs that look like the waves of the ocean or the knots of a tree root. It's not just camouflage, it's a statement. It says, "We are part of this land, and you are not." But let's strip away the blue paint for a moment and look at the people beneath it. Before they were the Picts, they were a loose confederation of tribes. The Roman geographer Ptolemy, who was essentially the Google Maps of the 2nd century, listed names that sound like heavy metal bands: the Cornavi in the far north, the Smyrte, the Caireni, and the formidable Caledoni in the central highlands. They didn't think of themselves as a single nation called Pictland. A warrior from the fertile fields of Fife probably had very little in common with a fisherman from the windswept Orkney Islands, other than a shared suspicion of anyone speaking Latin. They lived in a society that was surprisingly sophisticated, despite the Roman propaganda describing them as savages living in mud. They were farmers and herdsmen, raising cattle, sheep, and pigs. They grew barley and oats, grinding grain in rotary querns to make bread and porridge, the breakfast of champions that still powers Scotland today. Their metalwork was exquisite. We find massive, heavy bronze armlets and collars in the archaeological record, pieces that required immense skill and artistry to create. These weren't crude bangles. They were status symbols, heavy with authority and beauty. If you were wearing a massive bronze snake coiled around your wrist, everyone knew you were someone to be reckoned with. The social structure was likely hierarchical, but not in the rigid, pyramid-style bureaucracy of Rome. It was tribal, familial, and based on loyalty and reputation. You followed a chieftain, not because he had a piece of paper saying he was in charge, but because he could protect your cattle, settle disputes, and lead you to victory when the neighbors tried to steal your sheep. It was a warrior culture, certainly. Status was won at the point of a spear. But it was also a culture deeply connected to the natural world. Their religion, what little we can guess of it, was animistic. They saw the divine in the landscape, spirits in the waterfalls, gods in the rivers, ancestors sleeping in the stone circles that had already been standing for thousands of years before the first Pict was born. When we talk about the Picts, we are talking about the late Iron Age people of Scotland. The Iron Age here didn't end just because the Romans showed up in the south of Britain in 43 AD. In fact, the arrival of Rome acted like a pressure cooker. Nothing unites a squabbling group of neighbors faster than a giant, imperialistic bully moving in next door. The presence of the legions in the south, and their constant probing attacks northward, forced these disparate tribes to start talking to each other. They had to organize. The Pictish identity was, in many ways, forged on the anvil of Roman aggression. The Romans called this land Caledonia, a name that has stuck around for poetic purposes, largely because it sounds romantic and misty. But for the soldiers stationed on the frontier, Caledonia was a place of dread. Tacitus, a Roman historian who wrote about his father-in-law, Agricola's campaigns, describes the people as having red hair and large limbs, linking them to the Germans. He describes a land that is shapeless and without end. It's a telling description. To the Roman mind, which loved straight roads, square cities, and clear borders, the north was terrifyingly formless. The forests were too deep, the bogs too treacherous. You could march an entire cohort into a glen and simply never see them again. There is a fascinating tension in how the Romans viewed these painted people. On one hand, they were barbarians, the ultimate other, existing outside the light of civilization. On the other hand, the Romans had a sneaking admiration for their toughness. There was a concept in the ancient world of the noble savage, the idea that people who lived hard, simple lives were somehow purer and more virtuous than the soft, corrupt city dwellers of the empire. The Picts were free. They didn't pay taxes to a distant emperor. They didn't spend their days worrying about court politics. They lived and died by the sword and the seasons. But let's not over-romanticize it. Life in Iron Age Scotland was hard. The average life expectancy was short. If the winter didn't get you, a raid from a rival tribe might, or a simple infection, or childbirth. Yet, they thrived. They built enduring structures. They navigated the treacherous seas in skin-covered boats. And they maintained a culture that was distinct, vibrant, and incredibly resilient. They were the immovable object that the irresistible force of Rome crashed against again and again. As we drift deeper into this story, we need to remember that the Picts didn't leave us any books. They left us riddles carved into stone. They left us hill forts that still crown the Scottish landscape like old crowns. They left us place names beginning with Pit, like Pitlochry or Pittenweem. But they didn't leave us their voice. We don't know what their language sounded like, though it was likely a Brittonic Celtic tongue related to Welsh. We don't know their songs. We are trying to reconstruct a ghost from the footprints it left in the mud. So, as the mist swirls around the highlands and the Roman eagles gleam in the distance, we stand on the precipice of history. The tribes are gathering. The beacon fires are being lit on the hilltops, signaling that the iron-clad strangers from the south are coming. The painted warriors are sharpening their spears, checking the straps on their shields, and looking toward the horizon. They don't know that they are about to become legends. They just know that this is their land, their earth, their home, and they are ready to bleed to keep it. If you wanted to visit a Pictish chieftain in the centuries before the Romans started drawing lines on maps, you wouldn't be knocking on the door of a timber longhouse in a valley. You would likely be craning your neck to look up at a prehistoric skyscraper that defied the architectural logic of the time. The landscape of Iron Age Scotland was dotted with these peculiar, imposing structures known as brochs, and to the modern eye, they look like something out of a high fantasy novel. Stone cooling towers rising starkly out of the heather, guarding the coastline and the fertile glens like silent sentinels. A broch is a masterpiece of dry stone engineering. It is essentially a hollow-walled tower, built without a single spoonful of mortar. The builders relied entirely on gravity, friction, and an intuitive understanding of stone stress that would make a modern civil engineer weep with envy. Some of these towers, like the famous Broch of Musa in Shetland, still stand over 40 feet high today, which is frankly ridiculous considering they have been battered by North Atlantic gales for 2,000 years. Imagine the audacity required to build one. You are living in a world without cranes, hydraulics, or blueprints. Yet, you decide to stack thousands of tons of heavy, irregular rock into a tapering tower that is perfectly circular and structurally sound enough to house your entire extended family, and probably your prize cows. The secret to their stability lies in their double-wall construction. The walls are hollow, consisting of an inner and outer skin tied together by stone slabs. This doesn't just save on materials, it makes the structure lighter and allows for internal staircases and galleries to run within the thickness of the wall itself. It also provides insulation. In the biting cold of a northern winter, that air gap would have helped keep the interior warmth from leaching out into the frost. Stepping inside a broch during the Iron Age would have been an assault on the senses. The ground floor was likely a barn for livestock, because if you have a fortress, you bring your assets inside. The smell of manure, damp wool, and peat smoke would have been thick enough to chew. Above the animals, on wooden mezzanine floors, the people lived, cooked, and slept, rising above the muck in a hierarchy of altitude. But why build them? That is the question that nags at archaeologists. Were they defensive bunkers? Were they symbols of power? If you are a local chieftain, building a 40-foot stone tower is a very loud way of saying, I am rich, I am powerful, and I have enough surplus food to feed a workforce for 5 years while they stack rocks. It's the Iron Age equivalent of parking a Lamborghini in the driveway. It's a deterrent. A raiding party from a neighboring tribe might crest a hill, see that imposing silhouette against the gray sky, and decide that stealing cattle from the guys living in the stone tower is too much hassle. It's easier to go pick on the people living in the wooden huts down the road. However, brochs weren't the only way the ancestors of the Picts kept the world at bay. If you didn't have the stone or the inclination to build a tower, you might decide to simply leave the land altogether and move onto the water. This brings us to the crannog. A crannog is an artificial island, painstakingly constructed in a loch or a river estuary. If building a broch sounds like hard work, building a crannog sounds like a punishment. You have to row out into freezing water, drive timber piles deep into the muddy bed of the loch, and then dump tons of boulders, brushwood, and soil into the frame until you have a solid platform rising above the waterline. On top of this man-made islet, you build a roundhouse. Living on a crannog offers the ultimate security system, a moat that you don't have to dig. To get to your front door, a visitor or an attacker would have to walk across a narrow timber causeway. If you felt threatened, you could simply dismantle the causeway or pull up the drawbridge, leaving you floating safely out of reach. There is something incredibly evocative about the image of a crannog at night. The glow of the hearth fire reflecting on the black water, the sound of the loch lapping against the pilings, and the total isolation from the wolves and warriors roaming the forests on the shore. It speaks of a society that was deeply wary, a world where safety was the primary currency. Yet, crannogs weren't just panic rooms. They were often located in prime spots for fishing and trade, utilizing the waterways as highways. Recent underwater archaeology has found that many crannogs were used for centuries, constantly repaired and expanded. Divers have found perfectly preserved wooden bowls, scraps of fabric, and even ancient butter buried in the mud beneath these sites, preserved by the anaerobic conditions. It gives us a snapshot of a domestic life that was surprisingly comfortable, provided you didn't mind the damp and the slight swaying of your house during a storm. Then, on a completely different scale, we have the hill forts. While brochs and crannogs might house a family or a small clan, hill forts were community projects. These were vast enclosures built on the summits of prominent hills, ringed by ramparts of earth and stone. often topped with timber palisades. Some, like the massive fort at Tapo North or the Eildon Hill North, could house hundreds, perhaps thousands of people, along with their herds. These were the proto-cities of the North. They served as tribal capitals, marketplaces, and religious centers. In times of crisis, the entire population of the surrounding area could retreat behind the walls, turning the hill into a citadel. There is a strange and baffling phenomenon associated with some of these Pictish-era forts: vitrification. In dozens of sites across Scotland, we find walls where the stones have literally melted and fused together into a glassy, slag-like mass. To achieve this, you need sustained, intense heat, temperatures reaching over 1,000 degrees Celsius. This wasn't an accidental campfire getting out of hand. This was an inferno. Archaeologists have argued for decades about why this happened. Was it a construction technique, a misguided attempt to strengthen the walls by fusing them? If so, it was a terrible idea, as vitrified walls are actually brittle and prone to collapse. The more likely and more sinister explanation is that it was an act of destruction. When one tribe conquered another, they didn't just burn the wooden huts, they destroyed the fortress itself. They would pile vast amounts of timber against the stone ramparts, which were laced with wooden beams for stability, and set it alight. The timber inside the wall would act like a kiln, superheating the rocks until they ran like lava. Destroying a fort in this way was a ritualistic killing of the site. It was a way of saying, your power is broken, your home is glass, you will never return here. It speaks to the ferocity of the tribal warfare that defined this era. The Picts were not a peaceful, flower-wearing commune. They were a fractured collection of warrior societies, constantly vying for dominance, land, and prestige. This fragmented landscape is crucial to understanding why the Romans had such a hard time when they finally arrived. There was no single king of the Picts to defeat. If you marched into Gaul, you could beat Vercingetorix, capture the capital, and call it a day. In Caledonia, if you burned down a hill fort, the survivors just melted into the woods or retreated to a broch in the next valley. You were fighting a hydra. Every valley had its own chieftain, its own stronghold, its own defensive strategy. The architecture of pre-Roman Scotland tells us that this was a society living on a knife edge of vigilance. They invested an enormous amount of their surplus energy into defense. They were clearly terrified of something. Maybe it was the tribe over the next mountain range. Maybe it was sea raiders. Or maybe it was just the brutal reality of the Iron Age, where resources were scarce and violence was a valid method of wealth redistribution. But amidst this paranoia, there was community. Building a broch or a hill fort requires cooperation. It requires a social contract. I'll help you carry these heavy stones today, and you'll help protect my sheep tomorrow. These structures were the physical manifestation of the tribe's strength. They were statements of permanence in a transient world. When a Roman soldier looked north and saw the smoke rising from a vitrified fort or the silhouette of a broch against the setting sun, he wasn't just seeing a pile of rocks. He was seeing a civilization that had dug its heels into the granite and refused to be moved. They had mastered their environment, turning the stone and the water into armor. And they were watching. In the late summer of 83 or 84 AD, the Roman war machine finally ground its way into the heart of the Caledonian resistance. The man leading the charge was Gnaeus Julius Agricola, the governor of Britannia, and a man whose ambition was as sharp and cold as a gladius. He had spent years methodically pushing the frontier north, building forts, subduing tribes, and probably complaining about the rain in letters back to Rome. But he knew that to truly conquer this island, he had to break the back of the Northern Confederacy. He had to bring them to a pitched battle. The tribes, usually content to raid and vanish into the mist, had realized that this wasn't just another skirmish. The Romans weren't leaving. So, for the first time, the clans put aside their ancient feuds and gathered in a massive host at a place the Romans called Mons Graupius. The exact location of Mons Graupius is one of the great lost coordinates of history. Archaeologists and historians have spent centuries throwing darts at maps of Aberdeenshire and Moray, arguing over whether it was the hill of Benachie, the pass of Grange, or somewhere else entirely. But wherever it was, picture a sloping hillside rising from a boggy plain, the crest of the hill bristling with 30,000 Caledonian warriors. They were a terrifying sight, a wall of noise, clashing shields, screaming insults, and the distinct rumble of war chariots racing back and forth in front of the lines. This was the last stand energy of a people who knew exactly what was coming. Opposing them, Agricola deployed his forces with cynical brilliance. He placed his auxiliary troops, soldiers recruited from other conquered lands like Batavia and Gaul, in the center with the cavalry on the wings. Crucially, he kept his elite Roman legionaries in reserve, well behind the front lines. His logic was brutal. If he could win the battle using only expendable non-citizen troops, it would be a greater glory. And if things went wrong, he still had the heavy infantry fresh to clean up the mess. It was a calculation that treated human lives like currency, which was essentially the Roman way. Before the swords clashed, we get one of the most famous moments in Scottish history, though it comes to us through a Roman filter. Tacitus, writing the biography of his father-in-law Agricola, puts a speech into the mouth of the Caledonian leader, a man named Calgacus. We don't know if Calgacus was a real high king or just a noble whose name sounded good in Latin, and we certainly don't know what he actually said. But Tacitus uses him to deliver a blistering critique of Roman imperialism that still stings 2,000 years later. Calgacus supposedly stands before his gathered warriors and points at the Romans, calling them the robbers of the world. He says, to robbery, slaughter, plunder, they give the lying name of empire. They make a desert and call it peace. It is a stunning piece of writing, a Roman historian admitting through the voice of a barbarian that the empire was a voracious, destructive beast. It paints the coming battle not just as a fight for land, but as a fight for the very soul of freedom against an insatiable, uniform tyranny. But rhetoric doesn't stop Pila. The battle began with a missile exchange, a deadly rain of javelins and stones. The Caledonians, with their small shields and long slashing swords, were experts at fighting at a distance, knocking away Roman spears. But Agricola ordered his Batavian and Tungrian cohorts to close the distance. These auxiliaries were trained to fight up close and personal, smashing the bosses of their shields into the faces of the enemy and stabbing with short swords. The long swords of the Caledonians were useless in a crush. They needed room to swing. The Roman line pressed forward, grinding up the slope, stepping over the bodies of the fallen, pushing the Caledonians back towards the dense woods at the top of the hill. The Caledonian chariots, which had been so intimidating on the flat ground, became liabilities on the uneven, corpse-strewn slope. The horses panicked, the wheels got stuck. It turned into a chaotic slaughter. The Romans were disciplined, relentless, a meat grinder made of iron and leather. When the Caledonian reserves tried to flank the Romans, Agricola's cavalry swept in and broke them. The cohesion of the tribal army shattered. It wasn't a retreat, it was a rout. Tacitus claims that 10,000 Caledonians fell that day, compared to only 360 Romans. These numbers are almost certainly inflated. Ancient historians treated casualty figures like creative writing prompts. But the devastation was real. The aftermath was grim. Tacitus describes a silence falling over the battlefield as night fell, broken only by the weeping of men and women. The smoke of burning houses rose into the twilight as the survivors, realizing all was lost, torched their own homes to deny the Romans the spoils. Some, in a final act of desperate mercy, killed their own wives and children rather than see them dragged off to Roman slave markets. Mons Graupius was a tactical masterpiece for Rome. Agricola had won his great victory. He sent laurel-wreathed letters back to Rome, claiming that all of Britain was now conquered. But here is the twist. It didn't matter, not even a little bit. Winning a battle in the Highlands is very different from holding the Highlands. The Romans couldn't garrison this wild, sprawling landscape. The supply lines were too long. The winter was closing in. And the Emperor Domitian, back in Rome, was getting jealous of Agricola's success. He recalled the general, and the legions began a slow, inevitable withdrawal south. The victory at Mons Graupius became a ghost almost immediately. The Romans retreated to the line of the Gasque Ridge, then further south still. The conquered tribes simply came down from the mountains, rebuilt their hill forts, and went back to their lives. The Roman eagle had struck, drawn blood, and then flown away. This set the pattern for the next 3 centuries. Rome could march in, burn things, and win battles, but they couldn't make the Picts Roman. They couldn't impose the grid. The land itself seemed to reject them. There's a haunting quality to the story of Mons Graupius, because despite the massive scale of the event described by Tacitus, the physical evidence is frustratingly absent. We haven't found the mass graves. We haven't found the field littered with thousands of broken swords. It exists almost entirely in the realm of literature and legend. Some historians have even suggested Tacitus made the whole thing up, or at least massively exaggerated a minor skirmish to make his father-in-law look like a hero. But assuming it happened, and the trauma of it likely rippled through the generations, it changed the Picts. It taught them a valuable lesson. Do not fight the Romans in an open field. Do not play their game. After Mons Graupius, the Picts rarely offered a pitched battle again. They turned to guerrilla warfare, ambushes, and raids. They became the mist. They learned that the Roman machine was heavy and slow, and that if you stayed light, if you stayed mobile, and if you knew the bogs better than they did, you could bleed the empire dry without ever offering them a target to strike. So, while Agricola got his triumph in Rome, the Caledonians kept their freedom. They paid for it in blood, certainly. The generation of warriors who died on the slopes of Mons Graupius left a void in the tribal leadership that would take years to fill. But the boundary line had been drawn. The Romans had reached their high water mark. From this point on, the history of the North isn't about Roman conquest. It's about Roman containment. It's about building walls to keep the monsters out. The eagle had landed, looked around, and realized that this was one nest it couldn't occupy. After the blood and noise of Mons Graupius faded into memory, the Roman Empire came to a sobering realization. The North was a bad investment. There were no cities to tax, no gold mines to plunder easily, and the locals were, frankly, more trouble than they were worth. So, instead of trying to swallow the porcupine, Rome decided to build a cage for it. This decision birthed one of the most imposing psychological and physical barriers in human history, a line in the sand drawn in stone that said, "Civilization ends here. Beyond this point, there be dragons." In 122 AD, the Emperor Hadrian visited Britain. Hadrian was a man who loved architecture and hated ambiguity. He looked at the ragged northern frontier and decided it needed tidying up. His solution was monumental. He ordered the construction of a wall spanning the entire width of the island, from the River Tyne in the east to the Solway Firth in the west. This wasn't a fence. It was a political statement carved into the landscape. Imagine standing on the ramparts of Hadrian's Wall in the 2nd century. To your south, there are paved roads, bathhouses, imported wine, and the Pax Romana. To your north, a vast brooding expanse of bog and forest where the rules of the empire dissolved into the mist. The wall itself was a beast, up to 10 feet wide and 15 feet high, built of squared stone, running for 73 miles. Every mile, there was a fortified gate, a mile castle, and between those, 2 watchtowers. It was a machine of surveillance designed to control movement, tax trade, and stop small raiding parties from driving stolen cattle back north. But the Romans, suffering from a chronic case of imperial restlessness, weren't satisfied. Only 20 years later, a new emperor, Antoninus Pius, decided that Hadrian hadn't been ambitious enough. He wanted his own conquest, his own triumph. So, the legions marched north again, pushing the frontier up to the narrow neck of land between the Firth of Forth and the Firth of Clyde. Here, they built a second barrier, the Antonine Wall. The Antonine Wall was a different animal entirely. While Hadrian's Wall was a rigid spine of grey stone, the Antonine Wall was built of turf, blocks of sod cut from the earth and stacked on a stone foundation. Don't let the word turf fool you into thinking it was a garden feature. This was a massive earthwork rampart, around 10 feet high, fronted by a ditch so deep and wide it was known as the Abyss. The ditch was often 40 feet wide and 12 feet deep, a treacherous pit filled with stakes and caltrops, nasty, spiky metal devices designed to maim feet. On top of the turf rampart stood a timber palisade, bristling with soldiers. For a brief, volatile period of about 20 years, the land between these 2 walls became a strange, pressurized buffer zone. The tribes living here, often referred to as the Maiate or the Votadini, were caught between the hammer and the anvil. They were technically under Roman occupation, but their loyalties were fluid. This was the Wild West of the ancient world. You had Roman patrols tramping through the glens, local chieftains playing both sides to keep their heads, and spies from the northern confederacies slipping through the woods to trade intelligence and goods. Life on the Antonine Wall was grim. The soldiers stationed there were often auxiliaries from the fringes of the empire: Thracians, Syrians, Spaniards. Imagine a Syrian archer, used to the dry heat of the Levant, shivering in a wooden barrack in Falkirk, while the Scottish rain lashed sideways against the walls for 3 weeks straight. It must have felt like a prison sentence. Archaeology gives us glimpses of their boredom and their coping mechanisms. We find dice, gaming boards, and letters home begging for warm socks and better beer. We find altars dedicated to Roman gods, but also to local spirits, a pragmatic hedging of bets by soldiers who felt that in this strange land, Jupiter might be too far away to hear them, so they better offer a libation to the local river goddess, just in case. For the Picts, or the Proto-Pictish tribes living north of the Antonine Wall, this barrier was an insult, but it wasn't an airtight seal. Walls are only as good as the men guarding them, and the Picts quickly learned that the Roman line was porous. They treated the wall not as an impassable object, but as a challenge. They probed it constantly. Small raiding parties would slip through the drainage culverts or scale the timber palisades on foggy nights. They would ambush patrols, steal supplies, and vanish before the alarm could be raised. There is a fantastic irony in the Roman strategy here. By building these walls, they essentially created the Picts. Before the walls, the northern tribes were disparate groups with their own petty squabbles. But nothing unifies a people like a common enemy building a giant barrier in their backyard. The walls defined us versus them. The people north of the wall began to see themselves as a collective entity, the Free North. The wall didn't just keep them out, it locked them together. The relationship across the frontier wasn't always violent. There were gates, after all. On market days, the frontier would have been a hive of activity. Locals from the north would bring furs, amber, slaves, and hunting dogs to trade for Roman pottery, wine, glassware, and jewelry. It was a zone of cultural osmosis. We find Roman coins hoarded in Iron Age settlements miles north of the wall, and we find local brooches and styles influencing the dress of the garrisons. The barbarians developed a taste for Roman wine. The Romans developed a respect for the warmth of Celtic wool cloaks, but the tension never truly broke. The Antonine Wall was a frontier too far. It was a logistical nightmare to supply, requiring grain shipments to be sailed up the dangerous coasts. The local tribes remained rebellious, constantly harassing the supply lines. The cost of maintaining a garrison of thousands of men in the middle of a hostile, unproductive bog eventually outweighed the prestige of holding it. Around 560 AD, barely 2 decades after it was built, the Romans made a strategic withdrawal. They packed up their gear, dismantled the timber forts, and retreated back to the stone security of Hadrian's Wall. They torched the gates of the Antonine Wall as they left, a final scorched earth policy to ensure the fortifications couldn't be used against them. It must have been a spectacular sight. A line of fire stretching across the waste of Scotland, signaling the failure of imperial ambition. The Picts watched them go. They reclaimed the land. The grass grew over the turf ramparts. The ditches began to silt up, and the great abyss became just another dip in the landscape. The retreat to Hadrian's Wall didn't end the conflict, but it changed the dynamic. The Romans accepted that they would not rule Scotland. The land between the walls remained a dangerous no-man's land, patrolled by Iriani, Roman scouts and spies, and roamed by Pictish warbands. The stone wall to the south became the permanent edge of the world. For the next 2.5 centuries, it stood as a monument to the stalemate. But the Picts now knew something important. The Romans could be made to leave. The giant, stone-faced empire wasn't invincible. It had a reverse gear. This knowledge fed the growing confidence of the Northern Confederation. They had seen the eagle turn tail. They had seen the turf wall abandoned to the sheep. And as they looked south toward the stone wall that still scarred the horizon, they didn't see a barrier anymore. They saw a target. The retreat from the Antonine Wall was the first crack in the dam, a sign that the tide of history was starting, very slowly, to turn in favor of the painted people. By the early 3rd century, the Roman Empire had grown tired of the nagging headache at the top of the world. The walls were leaking. The treaties were being ignored. The tribes north of Hadrian's Wall, now coalescing into two main groups, the Maiate near the wall and the Caledonians further north, had grown bold. They were no longer just raiding. They were insulting the dignity of Rome. In 208 AD, the empire decided to stop slapping the mosquito and start burning down the forest. The man who arrived to strike the match was the Emperor Septimius Severus, and he was not a man interested in half measures or diplomatic nuances. Severus was a force of nature. Born in Leptis Magna in modern-day Libya, he was the first African emperor of Rome, a hard-bitten, pragmatic soldier who had fought his way to the purple through a brutal civil war. He was an old man by the time he reached Britain, 62 years old and riddled with gout, but his mind was as sharp and cruel as a flensing knife. He brought with him an imperial entourage that included his formidable wife, Julia Domna, and his two squabbling sons, Caracalla and Geta. He didn't come to inspect the frontier. He came to exterminate the threat. He brought a massive invasion force, estimated at over 40,000 men, supported by the Classis Britannica, the Roman fleet. This was the shock and awe of antiquity. The campaign Severus launched was fundamentally different from Agricola's. Agricola had sought a battle. Severus sought a grinding, methodical conquest of the landscape itself. He realized that the true enemy wasn't just the warriors with the spears, but the land they lived in. The highlands were a nightmare of trackless forests, bottomless bogs, and misty glens where an army could march in circles until it starved. So, Severus turned his legions into a construction crew. As they marched north, they cut down entire forests. They built bridges over raging rivers. They laid corduroy roads, logs placed side by side over the marshes to float their heavy artillery across the muck. It was an attempt to impose Roman order on chaotic geology. But the Pictish tribes had learned their lesson from Mons Gropius. They looked at this leviathan marching north and simply refused to engage. They vanished. They stripped the land of food, drove their cattle into hidden valleys, and watched from the tree lines. They waged a war of attrition that was psychologically devastating to the Romans. A legionary would step off the log road to relieve himself and disappear into the bog, pulled down by the weight of his armor. A foraging party would enter a thicket and never come out. Arrows would fly out of the mist, strike a centurion, and by the time the Romans formed a shield wall, the attackers were gone, leaving only the sound of the wind in the pines. The Roman historian Cassius Dio gives us a grim account of this campaign. He writes that the Romans suffered terribly, losing up to 50,000 men, a number that is likely exaggerated but indicative of a catastrophe. The soldiers were dying not from sword strokes, but from exhaustion, disease, and the relentless, bone-deep cold. When men fell behind, too weak to walk, their comrades would sometimes kill them rather than leave them to the mercy of the Caledonians. It was a brutal, ugly slog into the heart of darkness. Severus, crippled by the pain in his joints, was eventually carried in a litter at the head of his troops. Imagine the scene. The emperor of the known world, wrapped in furs, his face twisted in pain, being carried through a desolate, rain-lashed landscape, determined to crush a people he couldn't even find. His frustration grew toxic. At one point, realizing that he couldn't bring the tribes to battle, he issued a chilling order to his soldiers, quoting from the Iliad, "Let no one escape sheer destruction, not even the babe in the mother's womb." This wasn't warfare anymore. It was an order for genocide. The Romans pushed incredibly far north, perhaps as far as the Moray Firth. They forced the tribes to sue for peace, extracting a treaty that involved the cession of land. But it was a hollow victory. The moment Severus turned his back to return to his winter quarters in York, Eboracum, the tribes revolted again. They knew the old wolf was dying. They knew the weather was on their side. The treaty was just a piece of paper. The bog was eternal. The story of this campaign also gives us a rare and fascinating glimpse into the voice of a Pictish woman, albeit through the filter of a Roman writer. During the peace negotiations, the Empress Julia Domna reportedly engaged in conversation with the wife of a Caledonian chieftain named Argentocoxos. Domna, trying to assert Roman moral superiority, made a snide comment about the sexual freedom of Caledonian women, who were rumored to consort openly with men of their choosing. The Caledonian woman's reply was legendary. She reportedly said, "We fulfill the demands of nature in a much better way than you do, for we consort openly with the best men, whereas you let yourselves be debauched in secret by the vilest." It's a devastating comeback, a rejection of Roman hypocrisy and a proud assertion of their own cultural values. It reminds us that the Romans weren't just fighting savages. They were fighting a culture that looked back at them with utter contempt. By 211 AD, Severus was on his deathbed in York. His body had finally given out, worn down by the campaign and the stress of his feuding sons. His last words to his sons were famously cynical: "Be harmonious, enrich the soldiers, and scorn all others." He died knowing deep down that he had failed. He had marched to the edge of the world, burned the land, and killed thousands. But the painted people were still there, watching from the hills, waiting for the dust to settle. The moment Severus took his last breath, the Roman threat evaporated. His son, Caracalla, a psychopath who was far more interested in securing the throne than fighting in a swamp, immediately abandoned the campaign. He made a hasty peace with the tribes, withdrew all Roman garrisons from Scotland, and retreated south to secure his power in Rome, and eventually murder his brother Geta. The retreat was total. The Romans pulled back to Hadrian's Wall, and this time they stayed there. The Severan campaigns were the high watermark of Roman ambition in Scotland. They never tried to conquer the north again. The cost was simply too high. The Picts had survived the wrath of the most powerful man on earth. They had survived the burning of their forests and the slaughter of their people. And in doing so, they had achieved something remarkable. They had effectively beaten the Roman Empire. not in a glorious set-piece battle, but by endurance, by using their landscape as a weapon, and by refusing to be broken. For the tribes, this victory was transformative. The pressure of the Severan invasion forced the disparate clans to cooperate on a scale they never had before. The loose alliances of the Iron Age were hardening into a confederation. The vacuum left by the Roman withdrawal allowed a new power structure to emerge. The Maiatai and Caledonians, mentioned by Roman writers, would soon disappear from the records, replaced by a single, unifying name that would echo through history: the Picts. Severus had wanted to destroy them, but in his failure, he likely helped create the nation that would haunt his empire's nightmares for the next 200 years. The ghosts of the north had won. When the Roman legions marched south after the death of Severus, they left behind a silence that lasted for nearly a century. It wasn't the silence of an empty room, but the heavy, pregnant silence of a forest before a storm. To the Romans manning the mile castles on Hadrian's Wall, the north had become a black box. They knew the tribes were still there. They could see the smoke of their hearth fires and occasionally catch a glimpse of a scout on a distant ridge. But they had no idea what was happening inside the machine. While Rome was busy with its own internal crises, assassinating emperors and fighting civil wars, the disparate tribes of Caledonia were undergoing a radical metamorphosis. They were evolving. This period, roughly the 3rd century AD, is the gestation period of the Pictish nation. It is the moment when the Caledonians and Maiatai and Vakomagi cease to be just a list of squabbling neighbors and start to coalesce into a singular, terrifying political entity. The catalyst for this transformation was, ironically, Rome itself. The sheer trauma of the Severan invasion had taught the northern tribes a lesson in scale. They realized that small, independent tribes were easily picked off or bribed. To survive next to a superpower, you had to become a superpower, or at least a confederation big enough to make the superpower think twice. We can see this shift written into the landscape itself. If you look at the archaeological record from this time, something interesting happens to the settlements. The sheer number of small, scattered homesteads begins to drop, and we see a rise in larger, more heavily fortified power centers. It suggests a centralization of power. The little fish were being eaten by the big fish. Local chieftains were swearing fealty to more powerful warlords, probably in exchange for protection or a share of the spoils from southern raids. This wasn't a democratic process. It was likely a brutal consolidation of authority, forged through marriage alliances, intimidation, and the sharp end of a spear. By the end of the 3rd century, the result of this pressure cooker was revealed. In 297 AD, a Roman orator named Eumenius stood up to deliver a speech, a panegyric, to the Emperor Constantius Chlorus. In this speech, he dropped a new name into the history books. He didn't talk about the Caledonians. He spoke of the Picti. This is the birth certificate of the Pictish people. He wasn't describing a new group of immigrants who had just arrived. He was using a new label for the old enemy, recognizing that they had changed. The painted ones were no longer just a rabble. They were a defined other, a collective threat that required a specific designation. This new Pictish identity was likely a loose confederation rather than a unified kingdom with a single capital. Think of it less like a modern nation-state and more like a mafia commission. You had powerful regional kings, perhaps one in the north, around the Moray Firth, and one in the south, around Angus and Perthshire, who could call upon the loyalty of lesser chieftains during times of war. They might not have liked each other, and they almost certainly fought amongst themselves over cattle and territory. But when the Roman eagle turned its gaze north, they could present a united front. The glue holding this confederation together was partly culture and partly economics. The economy of the north was shifting. For centuries, it had been agrarian, but during this period of Roman silence, a new industry emerged: predation. The Roman province to the south was rich. It had fat cattle, silver coins, wine, and manufactured goods. Raiding became a legitimate career path for a young Pictish noble. It was a rite of passage. You gathered a band of hot-headed warriors, slipped past the Ariani, the Roman scouts, climbed over or sailed around the wall, and came back with a herd of stolen cows and a story to tell. These raids served a dual purpose. Firstly, they brought wealth into the highlands, allowing chieftains to reward their followers with gifts, the classic gift-giving economy of the heroic age. If a king could give you a Roman silver cup and a fine sword, you followed him. Secondly, raiding acted as a pressure valve for internal violence. Instead of fighting your neighbor over a boundary stone, you both went south to fight the Romans. It focused the aggression outward. The wall, intended to keep the barbarians out, actually helped to professionalize them. It gave them a constant, wealthy target against which to sharpen their skills. During this time, the Picts also began to master the sea. We often think of them as a land-based people, hiding in the heather, but they were islanders at heart. The geography of Scotland, with its deep lochs and fractured coastline, demanded maritime skill. The Picts developed the curragh, a vessel made of a wooden frame covered in animal hides. It sounds flimsy to modern ears, essentially a leather boat. But these things were incredibly seaworthy. They were light, rode the waves like a cork, and could be landed on any beach. A fleet of curraghs could appear out of the sea mist, strike a coastal Roman villa, and vanish back into the grey water before the legions could even saddle their horses. This naval capability fundamentally changed the strategic equation. Hadrian's Wall was a magnificent barrier against a land army, but it was useless against pirates. The Picts could simply sail around the ends of the wall. This forced the Romans to build coastal defenses down the east and west coasts, stretching their resources even thinner. The Pictish navy wasn't a formal fleet with admirals and uniforms, but a swarm of independent raiders who knew the tides and the hidden coves better than anyone else. The silence of the 3rd century was also a time of cultural deepening. This is likely when the unique Pictish artistic style began to incubate, the precursor to the symbol stones we will see later. The designs they tattooed on their skin, the crescents, the beasts, the intricate knots, were becoming a shared visual language, a way of signaling membership in this new, broader confederation. To be a Pict was to belong to a warrior elite that defined itself by its resistance to Rome. It's important to remember that Pict was an exonym, a name given to them by outsiders. We don't know what they called themselves. They might have called themselves Brittany, the people of the designs, a term related to the word Britain. But whether they embraced the Roman label or had their own name, The reality on the ground was undeniable. The north had hardened. The disparate tribes that Agricola had scattered like chaff had fused into a block of iron. By the time the Roman historical record picks up the thread again in the 4th century, the situation has changed dramatically. The Romans are no longer talking about expeditions to conquer the north. They are talking about defense. They are talking about containment. The initiative has passed to the Picts. They are no longer the victims of imperial aggression. They are the aggressors. They are the ones dictating the tempo of the war. This era of confederation building is the hidden chapter of Pictish history. It's the dark room where the photo was developed. Without the external pressure of Rome, the tribes might have remained fragmented for centuries. But the constant threat of the empire forced them to evolve or die. They chose evolution. They built a society that was flexible, militarized, and deeply xenophobic towards the south. As the 3rd century bled into the 4th, the Romans began to rot from within. Inflation, civil war, and barbarian pressure on the Rhine and Danube were weakening the empire's grip. And up in the mist-shrouded hills of Caledonia, the Picts were watching. They saw the cracks appearing in the stone. They sensed the wavering resolve of the garrisons. The new confederation was ready to test its strength. The painted people were done hiding in the shadows. They were about to step onto the main stage of history, and they were bringing fire with them. For generations, the people of Roman Britain had slept soundly under the blanket of the Pax Romana, believing that the wall in the north and the forts along the coast were immutable facts of life, as permanent as the stars. But in the year 367 AD, they woke up to a nightmare that shattered that illusion forever. This event is known to history as the Barbarica Conspiratio, the Great Conspiracy, and it remains one of the most terrifying and impressive examples of coordinated warfare in the ancient world. It wasn't just a raid. It was a synchronized, multi-front dismantling of the Roman province by enemies who were supposed to hate each other as much as they hated Rome. The genius of the Great Conspiracy lay in its impossible timing. In the ancient world, coordinating an attack between different tribes across hundreds of miles of sea and land, without radios or written orders, was supposed to be impossible. Yet somehow, the Picts managed it. From their strongholds in the highlands, they reached out across the Irish Sea to the Scotti, the raiders from Ireland, and across the North Sea to the Saxons of Germany. We don't know how they did it. Did Pictish diplomats travel in skin boats through the winter storms to broker these alliances? Did they meet on neutral ground, perhaps the Isle of Man, to carve up the map of Britain? However it happened, the result was a masterpiece of strategic timing. The attack began with the blinding of the empire. For years, the Romans had relied on a special class of scouts known as the Ariani. These were local men, paid by Rome to range north of the wall, infiltrate the tribes, and bring back intelligence on troop movements. They were the early warning system. But in 367, the Ariani didn't report the gathering storm. Why? Because they had been bought. The Picts, flush with the wealth of previous raids, had bribed the very eyes of Rome. The scouts took the Pictish silver and kept their mouths shut. So, when the hammer fell, the Roman commanders were deaf, dumb, and blind. The assault hit from every direction simultaneously. It must have felt apocalyptic. To the north, the Pictish Confederation poured over Hadrian's Wall. not in small bands, but in an overwhelming flood that bypassed the forts and swept into the civilian hinterlands. To the west, the Scoti landed their currachs on the beaches of Lancashire and Wales, burning villas and seizing captives. To the east and south, the longships of the Saxons and Franks struck the Saxon shore, the line of coastal forts designed to repel them. It was a perfect storm. The Roman military leadership was decapitated in the opening moves. Nectaridus, the Count of the Maritime Tract, responsible for coastal defense, was killed in action. Fullefords, the Duke of the Britons, in charge of the northern frontier, was ambushed and either captured or effectively neutralized. With their generals dead or missing, the Roman discipline crumbled, units deserted. Soldiers threw down their standards and melted into the countryside, or worse, joined the looters. The province, which had been a land of manicured hedgerows, tile-roofed villas, and straight roads, descended into anarchy. Imagine the psychological shock for a Roman Briton living in a villa near York. You have lived your entire life in peace. You speak Latin. You drink wine from Gaul. You have underfloor heating. Suddenly, the horizon is black with smoke. Bands of warriors with painted faces are riding through your fields. The legions, the invincible iron men who were supposed to protect you, are nowhere to be seen. The structure of civilization simply dissolved. The raiders weren't interested in occupying land. They were interested in movable wealth. They stripped the province bare. Silver plate, gold coins, livestock, and people, thousands of people, were dragged off to be slaves in the north or across the sea. The chaos lasted for over a year. Britain was essentially a failed state, ruled by roving bands of barbarians and gangs of deserters who realized that plunder paid better than a legionary's salary. The scale of the disaster was so great that it sent shockwaves all the way to the Emperor Valentinian Thracias, who was busy fighting his own wars in Gaul. He realized that Britain was on the verge of being lost entirely. He needed a fixer. He sent his best general, a man named Count Theodosius, the father of the future Emperor Theodosius. Theodosius arrived in 368 AD, landing at Richborough in Kent with 4 elite units. What he found was a province in ruins. He didn't immediately march north to fight a pitched battle. There was no single army to fight. Instead, he waged a counterinsurgency operation. He divided his troops into small, mobile, flying columns and began to sweep the country, ambushing the raiding parties that were weighed down with loot. He offered amnesty to the deserters, realizing he needed every man he could get, and slowly, painfully, re-established the chain of command. It took Theodosius 2 years to clean up the mess. He fought his way to London, which had been under siege in all but name, and then pushed north, clearing the roads and reclaiming the cities. He eventually reached Hadrian's Wall, which he found abandoned and partly ruinous. He ordered it repaired, the gates rehung, and the forts regarrisoned. He even created a new province, likely in the north, which he named Valentia, in honor of the emperor, a piece of propaganda designed to say, "Look, we're back, and we're stronger than ever." But the great conspiracy had changed everything. Theodosius might have restored the borders, but he couldn't restore the confidence. The people of Britain now knew that the empire was fragile. They knew that the wall could be breached. They knew that the legions could fail. And crucially, the Picts knew it too. They had learned that if they worked together with other enemies of Rome, they could bring the giant to its knees. They had tasted the immense wealth of the South, and that hunger would never go away. The betrayal of the Ariani was particularly damaging. Theodosius disbanded the corps completely, realizing they could never be trusted again. This meant that from 368 onwards, Rome was flying blind in the north. They had no intelligence network beyond the wall. The Picts were once again a mystery, hidden behind the curtain of the frontier, plotting their next move in secret. The sheer logistical achievement of the conspiracy suggests that the Pictish society of the 4th century was far more complex than the savage stereotype allows. To coordinate a war on 3 fronts requires a calendar. It requires a shared understanding of geography. It requires a hierarchy capable of enforcing the plan. The Pictish kings who orchestrated this were not just warriors. They were statesmen and strategists of the highest order. They had identified the strategic weakness of Rome, its overextension, and exploited it with surgical precision. This event also marked a shift in the nature of the threat. It wasn't just about the Picts anymore. It was about a new, multi-ethnic alliance of barbarians surrounding the province. The Picts were the northern hammer, the Scots were the western anvil, and the Saxons were the blade at the throat. For the next few decades, Rome would be playing a desperate game of whack-a-mole, rushing troops from one side of the island to the other to plug the leaks. The Great Conspiracy was the beginning of the end for Roman Britain. Even if the end took another 40 years to arrive, it hollowed out the province. The villas that were burned were often not rebuilt. The economy contracted. The rich buried their gold in the ground, giving us the magnificent hoards we find today, and never came back to retrieve it. The fear had set in. The ghosts of the north had shown that they could walk through walls, and the long twilight of Roman rule had begun. The end of Roman Britain didn't happen with a nuclear explosion or a single cataclysmic battle that wiped the slate clean. It happened on a Tuesday, or perhaps a rainy Thursday, with the squeak of an ungreased cartwheel and the flapping of a sail. In the early years of the 5th century, specifically around 407 to 410 AD, the unthinkable became reality. The legions, those eternal fixtures of the landscape who had been marching, drilling, and complaining about the beer for nearly 400 years, simply packed up and left. A usurper general named Constantine III had stripped the garrison to the bone, taking the last effective field army across the Channel to fight for his claim to the imperial throne in Gaul. He left behind a skeleton crew of old men and boys, and a population that had forgotten how to hold a spear. When the local magistrates wrote to the Emperor Honorius in 410 AD, begging for help against the Saxon and Pictish raids, the emperor's reply was essentially a new phone who dis message. He told the cities of Britain to look to their own defenses. It was the ultimate geopolitical breakup text. For the Picts, watching from the northern hills, this must have been a confusing moment. For centuries, their entire cultural identity, their economy, and their warrior ethos had been defined by the presence of the great enemy. Rome was the whetstone against which they sharpened their iron. Rome was the source of the silver they coveted, the wine they drank, and the fear that kept their confederation united. When the last Roman galley disappeared over the grey horizon of the North Sea, it left a vacuum so sudden and so profound that the air must have popped. The immediate aftermath was a free-for-all. The wall, once the terrifying line of death, became just a long pile of convenient building materials. The Picts didn't just raid it, they walked over it. They likely walked along the top of it, laughing at the empty mile castles where the ghost of auxiliary guards still seemed to linger. But here is where the narrative shifts. You might expect that the Picts would simply swarm south and conquer the whole island, turning London into a Pictish capital. But they didn't. Why? Because the nature of the game had changed. The Picts were raiders, not empire builders in the Roman sense. They were interested in portable wealth, cattle, slaves, silver. But with the Roman administration gone, the economy of Britain collapsed. The coin supply dried up. The mass-produced pottery factories shut down. The villas were abandoned. There was less to steal. The prize had lost its luster. Instead of a grand conquest, what emerged was a fractured, violent, and intensely local struggle for dominance. The vacuum left by Rome was filled by a patchwork of British warlords, men who remembered the Roman ways but ruled like tribal chieftains. These were the men of the north, the Hen Ogledd, ruling kingdoms like Strathclyde, based at Dumbarton Rock, Gododin in the Lothians, and Reged in the west. These were the Britons who had been Romanized, who spoke a bit of Latin, and who called themselves citizens, but who now had to fight like Picts to survive. The relationship between the Picts and these new British kingdoms was complex. It wasn't just constant war, it was a fluid mix of raiding, trading, intermarriage, and temporary alliance. We have to stop thinking of a hard border. The frontier became a debatable land, a zone where a Pictish king might marry a British princess to secure a treaty, or where a British warlord might hire Pictish mercenaries to help him kill his rival next door. The sharp line of the wall dissolved into a messy, bloody gradient. However, the Picts did expand. This is likely the period where they solidified their control over the lands south of the Mount, the Grampian Mountains, and pushed their influence down into what is now Fife and Tayside. They were claiming the fertile lowlands, the best farming country. This suggests a population boom, the success of the previous century, the wealth brought in by raiding, had likely led to more mouths to feed. The warrior elite needed land to give to their sons. The expansion wasn't just about greed, it was about demographics. We also see a shift in the Pictish psychology. With Rome gone, they were no longer the underdogs. They were now the premier power in the north. This status required a new kind of projection. They couldn't define themselves merely as anti-Roman anymore. They had to define themselves by what they were. This is when the great symbol stones, which we will discuss in detail soon, likely started to become more prominent as markers of territory and status. They were carving their identity into the earth, saying, "This valley belongs to the Viper clan," or "This river is under the protection of the double disc." The departure of the legions also changed the religious landscape. Rome had been Christian, mostly, by the end of the 4th century. When the official structure collapsed, Christianity didn't disappear, but it lost its imperial backing. It survived in pockets among the British elite. For the pagan Picts, this meant the god of Rome had apparently failed. Their own gods, the spirits of the wind and the war deities, had driven the invaders into the sea. This likely led to a resurgence of pagan confidence. Why switch to the religion of the losers? But there was another player entering the game. one who would cause more trouble for the Picts than the Romans ever did, the Angles and Saxons. With the Roman fleet gone, the North Sea became a highway for Germanic settlers. At first, they came as mercenaries, hired by desperate British tyrants like the infamous Vortigern to fight off the Picts. This is the classic swallowing the spider to catch the fly scenario. The mercenaries fought the Picts, sure, but then they looked around, saw the fertile land of England, and decided to stay. This created a new three-way dynamic. In the north, you had the Picts. In the center and west, the British kingdoms. In the south and east, the encroaching Saxons and Angles. The Picts suddenly found themselves with a new neighbor in the Lothians and Northumbria, the kingdom of Bernicia, founded by Anglian warlords. These newcomers were just as tough, just as pagan, and just as hungry for land as the Picts were. The Roman War was over. The Germanic War was just beginning. This period of the 5th century is often called the Dark Ages, a term historians hate because it implies people were stupid. They weren't stupid, they were just unrecorded. But for the Picts, it wasn't a dark age at all. It was a golden age of autonomy. They were free. They had seen off the greatest empire the world had ever known. They were building a society that was vibrant, artistic, and militarily formidable. The archaeology of this time shows us that the Pictish hierarchy was deepening. We find nuclear forts, small, heavily defended citadels on rocky outcrops like Dunad, though that was possessed by the Scots, or Dundurn. These weren't the massive tribal refuges of the Iron Age. These were the castles of kings. A small, elite warband would live there, feasting, drinking mead imported from the south, and planning their next move. It brings to mind the atmosphere of Beowulf, a hall culture driven by honor, oaths, and the display of wealth. The Picts were also adapting to the new reality of post-Roman goods. Even though the official trade had stopped, the desire for luxury hadn't. We find Pictish silver chains, massive, heavy things that were almost certainly made by melting down Roman silver plate. They were literally repurposing the debris of the empire to forge their own symbols of power. It's a perfect metaphor. They took the raw material of Rome and hammered it into a Pictish shape. So, as the 5th century progressed, the Picts weren't just ghosts haunting the frontier. They were the masters of their domain. They had pushed their borders south. They had forced the remaining Britons to respect them. They were engaging with the new Germanic arrivals, not as subjects, but as rivals. The withdrawal of Rome had removed the ceiling on their ambition. The legions had marched away, leaving the gate to the north wide open, and the Picts stepped through it, blinking in the sunlight, ready to inherit the earth. If you walk through the farmers' fields of Aberdeenshire, or along the coastal paths of the Moray Firth today, you might stumble upon a ghost standing in plain sight. It won't be a spectral warrior or a Roman ruin, but a slab of grey granite or sandstone, jutting out of the earth like a jagged tooth. It has no straight edges, no architectural polish. It looks, at first glance, like just another rock left behind by the retreating glaciers. But if the light catches it at the right angle, perhaps in the low, raking sun of a winter afternoon, lines appear. Deep, confident grooves carved into the hard surface reveal shapes that are so stylized, so alien, and yet so artistically assured that they stop you in your tracks. These are the Class Y symbol stones, the most enduring and baffling legacy of the Picts. They are the riddle that refuses to be solved, dating primarily from the 6th to the 8th centuries, though their origins might stretch back earlier into the Roman Iron Age. These stones are the first true voice of the Pictish people. But it is a voice we cannot understand. Unlike the Egyptians with their hieroglyphs or the Romans with their inscriptions, the Picts left us no Rosetta Stone. We have the code, but we lost the key 1500 years ago. The Class 1 designation is archaeological shorthand for the earliest phase of this tradition. These are unhewn stones, raw boulders chosen for their shape and location, not quarried or squared off. The symbols are incised, meaning they are cut into the rock rather than carved in relief. The artist would have taken a hammer and a chisel, likely made of high-quality iron, and pecked away the surface with a steady, practiced hand. There is no room for error here. You cannot erase a line cut into granite. The confidence of the strokes suggests that these weren't doodles. They were sacred, masterful acts of creation. The symbols themselves fall into two frustratingly distinct categories: the abstract and the representational. The abstract symbols are the ones that keep historians awake at night. You have the double disc and Z-rod, two circles connected by a bridge, overlaid with a zigzag line that looks like a broken spear or a lightning bolt. You have the crescent and V-rod, a moon shape pierced by a broken arrow. You have snakes, mirrors, combs, and strange shapes that look like tuning forks or flower pots. They are geometric, precise, and repeated with an almost industrial consistency across the length and breadth of Scotland. A crescent and V-rod in Fife looks almost exactly like one in Orkney. This implies a standardized system of meaning, a visual grammar that every Pict understood instantly. Then there are the animals. If the abstract symbols feel alien, the animals feel startlingly modern. The Pictish artists were geniuses of minimalism. With just a few curving lines, they could capture the essence of a creature with more vitality than a photograph. We see wolves with laid-back ears, stalking their prey. We see bulls with heavy shoulders and powerful necks. We see eagles, salmon, boars, and stags. These aren't cartoon animals. They are biological observations carved by people who lived alongside these beasts, hunted them, and respected them. The Burghead bulls, found in a fort on the Moray coast, are masterpieces of kinetic energy, looking as if they are about to charge right off the stone. But there is one animal that defies classification, a creature that appears more often than any other: the Pictish beast. It looks like a hallucination. It has a long snout, a trailing crest or lappet, spiraling limbs, and a body that seems to flow like liquid. Is it a dolphin, a seahorse, a kelpie, water horse from folklore? Some have suggested it's a stylized elephant based on descriptions from travelers, but that seems a stretch. The most compelling theory is that it represents a mythological creature, perhaps a water deity or a clan totem that held supreme spiritual significance. It is the signature of the Pictish imagination, a monster that is elegant, fluid, and utterly unique. So, what are they saying? The theories are as numerous as the stones themselves. The most widely accepted theory today is that the symbols represent names. Think of them as a heraldic language, similar to a coat of arms. In this reading, the double disc and Z-rod might represent a specific name like Brady, while the wolf represents the name Talok. A stone with two symbols might be a memorial stating, "Here lies Pridi, son of Talok." Or perhaps, "The lands of the Wolf clan meet the lands of the Crescent clan here." This aligns with the fact that symbols are often paired. If you look at Ogham inscriptions, a scratch mark alphabet imported from Ireland that sometimes appears on later stones, they almost always record personal names. It makes sense that the symbols would do the same. Another theory leans into the matriarchal mystery of the Picts. Could the symbols represent marriage alliances? If the Picts really did trace inheritance through the female line, a controversial idea we will explore later, then the symbols might record complex dynastic marriages. The mirror and comb symbol, which appears frequently, is often associated with women. It might denote a high-status female, a queen or a matriarch, indicating her dowry or her lineage. It's a gentle reminder that in this warrior society, women held a place of significant visibility. Or perhaps they are territorial markers. You are walking through a dense forest in the year 600 AD. You come to a clearing and see a massive standing stone carved with a boar and a zeed rod. To you, a literate Pict, this isn't art. It's a no trespassing sign. It says, "You are now entering the territory of the Boar King. Watch your step." The stones are often found near boundaries, river crossings, or the entrances to glens, supporting the idea that they served as landmarks in a mental map of the kingdom. There is a tactile magic to these stones. If you were to run your hand over one, though please don't, the oils in your skin damage the lichen, you would feel the connection to the tattoo theory. The designs on the stones are linear, flowing, and perfectly suited for the curve of a human arm or shoulder. It is highly probable that the stones are just the permanent geological version of the art that the Picts wore on their bodies. When a great king died, his tattoos rotted with him. By carving them into stone, his family ensured that his identity, his brand, would last forever. The stone is a petrified tattoo. The geographical spread of these Class 1 stones tells us something profound about the political unity of the Picts during this period. We find them from the Shetlands in the far north down to the Firth of Forth in the south. The fact that the symbols are so consistent across this vast, difficult terrain proves that the Picts were not just a rabble of isolated tribes anymore. They shared a culture. They shared a written language. Even if it wasn't writing as we know it, a Pict from the Orkneys could travel 200 miles south to Angus, look at a stone, and understand exactly what it meant. That is the definition of a nation. One of the most haunting aspects of the Claddagh stones is their silence regarding religion. There are no crosses on these early stones, no angels, no saints, no biblical scenes. They are undeniably pagan. They speak of a world where the divine was found in the strength of the bull, the speed of the salmon, and the mystery of the crescent moon. They are the last great monument of indigenous European animism before the tide of Christianity washed over the north. They capture a worldview that saw nature not as a resource to be exploited, but as a mirror of human society, full of power and spirit. The craftsmanship also hints at the presence of a professional class of artisans. You don't just wake up one morning and carve a perfect double-disc and Z-rod into granite. It requires tools, training, and time. This implies that Pictish society was wealthy enough to support artists, people who didn't have to farm or fight, but whose job was to maintain the visual culture of the tribe. These masons would have traveled from fort to fort, commissioned by chieftains to mark a grave or a boundary, carrying their pattern books in their heads. Today, many of these stones still stand exactly where they were placed 1500 years ago. They are often lonely figures in the middle of a plowed field, ignored by the sheep grazing around them. Others have been moved to museums or church porches to protect them from the acid rain. But even behind glass, they retain their power. They are messages sent across time, desperate to be read. When you look at the serpent stone at Aberlemno or the eagle stone at Strathbeffer, you are looking into the eyes of the Picts. You are seeing what they valued. They didn't value long-winded speeches or bureaucratic records. They valued the bold, the symbolic, and the enduring. They understood that words fade, but stone remains. They carved their riddles deep, perhaps knowing that one day people like us would stand before them, baffled and awestruck, trying to whisper back to the ghosts. In the year 565 AD or thereabouts, a boat made of wicker and hide pulled onto the rocky shore of the Moray Firth, carrying a man who was about to change the moral landscape of the North forever. His name was Columcille, or as history knows him, Saint Columba. But if you are picturing a fragile, whispery old man in a stained glass window, you need to adjust your mental image. Columba was an Irish prince, a member of the Uí Néill dynasty, and a man who had been exiled from his homeland, essentially for starting a bloody civil war over a copyright dispute involving a book of Psalms. He was a soldier for Christ, certainly, but the emphasis was often on the soldier. He was charismatic, possibly over 6 feet tall, with a voice that was said to be loud enough to be heard a mile away when he was preaching or shouting. He had come to the land of the Picts not just to save souls, but to do penance. His mission was to convert as many pagans as the number of men who had died in the battle he caused. To do that, he knew he couldn't just wander around the farmsteads talking to shepherds. He had to go to the top. He had to face the king. The man sitting at the top of the Pictish hierarchy at this moment was King Bride, son of Maelchon. Bride is the first Pictish king who feels like a fully fleshed out historical figure rather than just a name on a list. He was a formidable overlord, described by the Venerable Bede as a most powerful king. His power center wasn't in the southern lowlands, but up in the north, likely at the hill fort of Craig Fadrig, looming over the modern city of Inverness. Bride was a man who had subdued the Orcadian fleet, who took hostages from lesser kings, and who commanded the loyalty of the formidable Pictish druids, or Magi. The encounter between Columba and Bride is one of the great cinematic moments of early Scottish history. We know about it primarily through a biography written a century later by Adamnan, another abbot of Iona. Adamnan's book, The Life of Columba, is essentially a piece of hagiography, propaganda designed to make Columba look like a superhero. But even through the bias, we get a vivid picture of a clash between two titans. Before Columba even reached the king's fortress, he had to navigate the strange, monster-filled landscape of the Great Glen. It is here, in Adamnan's account, that we get the very first written record of something strange in the water. As Columba was preparing to cross the River Ness, he saw locals burying a man who had been bitten by a water beast. Undeterred, and perhaps looking for a chance to flex his spiritual muscles, Columba ordered one of his monks to swim across and fetch a boat. The beast, sensing fresh meat, rose from the depths with a roar. The locals were terrified. Columba, standing on the bank, calmly raised his hand, made the sign of the cross, and commanded, "Think not to go further, nor touch the man. Quick, go back." The beast, apparently terrified of the Irishman, fled as if dragged by ropes. Whether this was the Loch Ness monster or just a very aggressive seal is up for debate, but it set the tone. Columba was not a man to be trifled with by man or beast. When Columba and his small band of monks finally trudged up the steep slope to Bridie's fortress at Craig Fadrig, they didn't receive a warm welcome. The king, likely advised by his chief druid Broishan, decided to give the cold shoulder. He ordered the massive wooden gates of the fortress barred shut. It was a power play. "You wait outside until I decide to let you in." Columba wasn't the waiting type. According to the legend, he walked up to the gates, made the sign of the cross on the wood, and knocked. The heavy bolts snapped back on their own. The timber groaned, and the gates swung wide open without a human hand touching them. Columba strode into the courtyard, his robes flapping in the wind, leaving the king's guards staring in open-mouthed shock. King Bride, realizing he had been upstaged in his own house, had the good sense to stand up and walk forward to greet the saint with reverence. What followed was a high-stakes wizard battle between the new religion and the old. The Pictish court was dominated by the druids, the keepers of the ancient knowledge, the stargazers, and the weather workers. Broichan, the king's foster father and chief advisor, was Columba's main antagonist. Adomnan describes a series of contests that sound like something out of Harry Potter. At one point, Columba and his monks began to chant their evening psalms outside the fortress. The druids, hating the sound of the strange Latin words, tried to drown them out with loud shouting and clashing of metal. Columba responded by singing Psalm 44 in a voice that miraculously amplified like a thunderclap, silencing the druids and terrifying the king. Later, when Columba wanted to leave, Broishan threatened to summon a storm and darkness to prevent his ship from sailing. Sure enough, a mist descended and a gale blew against them. Columba, unfazed, boarded his ship and ordered the sails raised against the wind. Miraculously, the vessel cut through the waves as if propelled by a jet engine, sailing directly into the teeth of the druid storm. Now, we have to take these miracles with a grain of salt. Adomnan was writing for an audience that expected their saints to control the weather. But beneath the magical duel lies a very real political negotiation. Bride wasn't an idiot. He was a pragmatist. He looked at Columba and saw more than just a magic trick. He saw a representative of the wider world. Christianity was the religion of the Franks, the Romans, and the Irish. It came with books. It came with literacy. It came with a network of contacts that stretched all the way to the Mediterranean. For a king like Bride, trying to hold together a confederation of disparate tribes, this new religion offered something useful, a unifying ideology. The old paganism was intensely local. Gods of this specific river, spirits of that specific hill. Christianity was universal. It offered a king of kings that stood above tribal squabbles. If Bride could align himself with this power, it would elevate his status above his rivals. Interestingly, it's not entirely clear if Bride actually converted. Adomnan never explicitly says, "and then the king was baptized." He says the king held Columba in high honor. It's possible that Bride played a clever game, allowing Columba to preach and founding monasteries, while keeping one foot in the old ways to avoid alienating his conservative base. He was hedging his bets. He allowed Columba to establish a foothold, but he didn't hand over the keys to the kingdom entirely. However, the meeting at Inverness broke the seal. Columba was granted safe passage through Pictland. He founded monasteries, or cells, which acted as spiritual forward operating bases. These weren't just churches. They were community centers, hospitals, schools, and diplomatic outposts. The monks brought new agricultural techniques, new medicines, and the Latin alphabet. They began to write down the history that the Picts had only ever spoken. The relationship between Bride and Columba also pacified the political situation. Columba, being an Uí Néill prince, acted as a guarantor of peace between the Picts and the Scots of Dal Riata, the Irish settlers on the west coast. For a few decades, the constant raiding slowed down. There was a stability that allowed art and culture to flourish. There is a wonderful humanity to the story of the druid Broichan as well. In one episode, Columba demands that Broichan release an Irish female slave he is holding. Broichan refuses. Columba warns him that if he doesn't, he will die. Shortly after, Broichan falls violently ill, seemingly choking to death. He sends a messenger to Columba begging for help. Columba sends back a pebble that he had blessed, with instructions to dip it in water and have the druid drink it, but only if he releases the girl. The girl is freed. The druid drinks the pebble water, and he recovers. The pebble, the white stone of Saint Columba, became a legendary healing artifact in Scotland for centuries. It shows Columba not just as a conqueror, but as a negotiator who used his power to protect the vulnerable. By the time Columba died in 597 AD, the spiritual Iron Curtain of the North had been breached. The Picts were not fully Christianized overnight. That would take centuries of slow percolation. But the door had been kicked open. The encounter at Craig Fadrig marked the moment the Picts began to join the mainstream of European history. They were inviting the new magic in. One can imagine King Bride standing on the ramparts of his fort, watching Columba's boat disappear down the great glen. He must have known that things would never be the same. The druids were grumbling in the background. The sky was grey and heavy, but the king had made his choice. He had seen the power of the book and the bell, and he decided that if he couldn't beat them, he would use them. The ghosts of the North were beginning to learn Latin. We often tend to think of religious conversion in the ancient world like a light switch being flipped. One day, everyone is painting their chests with woad and worshipping the spirit of the oak tree. The next day, a saint walks in, shouts a few verses, splashes some water, and suddenly everyone is sitting in pews, singing hymns and feeling guilty. But history, like human nature, is rarely that linear. The conversion of the Picts wasn't a sudden explosion of light. It was a slow, creeping sunrise that took centuries to burn off the mist of the old gods. It was a negotiation, a blending, and often a confusing muddle, where Jesus was treated not as the only God, but simply as the newest, most powerful member of the pantheon, a high king of the spirits who had better magic than the local river deity. If you walked through Pictland in the 7th century, you would have seen a landscape in transition. The ancient stone circles, standing since the Bronze Age, were still there, brooding on the moors. The druids were still whispering to the wind. But now, in the glens and along the rugged coastlines, you would see something new. Simple timber huts with thatched roofs, surrounded by earthen banks. These were the early monasteries, the beachheads of the new faith. They weren't the grand stone cathedrals of later medieval Europe. They were humble, gritty, working communes where men with tonsured heads spent their days reclaiming the land from the bog and copying holy texts by the light of tallow candles. While Saint Columba gets all the headlines because he had a great biographer, he wasn't the only one walking the heather. The conversion of the Picts was a pincer movement. From the west came the Scotic monks of Iona, speaking Gaelic. From the south, arguably even earlier, came the influence of St. Ninian and the mission at Whithorn, pushing up through the lands of the Britons. And let's not forget St. Moluag, a contemporary of Columba, who is often written out of the history books because he didn't have a PR team. Moluag founded a major monastery on the island of Lismore and established important centers at Rosemarkie and Mortlach. Legend says he and Columba were rivals, racing each other to claim Lismore. Moluag, seeing he was about to lose the boat race, supposedly cut off his own finger and threw it onto the beach, shouting, "My flesh and blood have touched the land first." It's a gruesome story, probably apocryphal, but it captures the fierce, almost tribal competitiveness of these early saints. They were spiritual warlords, battling for territory. For the average Pictish farmer, this new religion must have been baffling but strangely attractive. The old gods were transactional and often terrifying. You sacrificed to the storm so it wouldn't destroy your crop. You sacrificed to the war god so you wouldn't die. Christianity, as preached by these rugged Celtic monks, offered something different: personal salvation and a codified set of laws that applied to everyone, even kings. But the Picts didn't just throw away their culture, they adapted it. This is why we don't find mass pits of smashed pagan idols in Scotland. Instead, we see a fascinating syncretism. The monks didn't necessarily chop down the sacred trees. They just carved a cross into the bark. They didn't blow up the standing stones. They incised a cross next to the serpent and the Z-rod. They baptized the landscape. You can see this physical transition in the archaeological record at places like Port Mahomac on the Tarbat Peninsula. This site is a treasure trove. It started as an elite secular settlement, possibly a fortress. Then, in the late 7th century, it transformed into a monastery. We find the remains of vellum-making workshops, where calfskins were stretched and scraped to make parchment for books. We find stylus pens and glass-working hearths. Port Mahomac gives us a sensory snapshot of this new world. Imagine the smell of the tannery, the acrid stench of urine and lime used to cure the hides. Then contrast that with the smell of beeswax and incense in the chapel. Hear the scratching of quills and the chanting of psalms mixing with the cry of seagulls and the roar of the North Sea. It was an industry of the holy. These monasteries were factories of knowledge. For a non-literate society like the Picts, the ability of these monks to store speech in books must have seemed like the highest form of sorcery. The conversion also solved a major problem for the Pictish kings, the Druids. The Druids were powerful. They were the keepers of the law, the genealogies, and the calendar. They could check the power of a king. The Christian church offered a replacement priesthood that was, theoretically part of a global hierarchy and could offer the king divine right. By converting, a king like Pridi or his successors could claim that they ruled not just because they were the strongest, but because God, the big God, the Roman God, had chosen them. It gave the monarchy a legitimacy that was untouchable. But the old beliefs didn't die easily. We have stories of cultis, celidae, or clients of God, hermits who went out into the wildest, most desolate places to live in solitary contemplation. They would find a cave on a cliff face or a tiny island in a loch and live there with the birds and the storms. In a way, they were very similar to the pagan shamans they replaced. They were holy men living on the edge of the world, acting as a bridge between the human and the divine. To a Pictish peasant, a culti living in a cave looked a lot like the old wise man who used to live in the same cave. Except now, he muttered Latin prayers instead of incantations to the moon. The art of the Picts began to change too. The symbols didn't disappear. They were too important for identity, but they began to share space with the cross. We start to see the emergence of the great cross slabs. The cross in the heather wasn't just a metaphor. It was a physical reality. Monumental stone crosses were erected at key sites, serving as preaching stations. Since there were no parish churches yet, the monks would travel to these crosses, ring a handbell. The early Celtic saints loved their handbells, and the locals would gather in the open air to hear the Mass. One of the most profound changes was in how they treated their dead. In the Deep Iron Age, the Picts had disposed of their dead in ways that are hard for us to trace. Excarnation, leaving the body to be picked clean by birds, or simple inhumation in cysts. But with Christianity came the idea of the resurrection of the body. You needed your bones to be together and facing east, ready to stand up when Gabriel blew his horn. So we start to see long cyst cemeteries, rows of stone-lined graves oriented east-west appearing in the landscape. It was a fundamental shift in how they viewed time and eternity. Death was no longer a dissolution into the spirits of the land. It was a sleep before the waking. However, the church itself was not a unified bloc. As the 7th century wore on, a tension began to simmer, a cold war of theology between the Celtic tradition of Columba and the Roman tradition arriving from the south. They argued over things that seemed trivial to us, like the correct shape of a monk's tonsure, shaved ear to ear versus the Roman crown, and most crucially, the calculation of the date of Easter. This wasn't just about calendars. It was about authority. Did the Pictish church take its orders from Iona and the traditions of their ancestors, or did it bow to the Bishop of Rome? This tension would eventually force the Pictish kings to make a hard geopolitical choice. But for now, in the hazy days of the conversion, the two traditions coexisted in a sort of messy harmony. You might have a monastery following the Irish rule down the road from a bishop who looked to Rome. It was a melting pot of ideas, art styles, and languages. The landscape of Pictland was quiet during these years, but it was a busy quiet. It was the silence of deep root growth. The warrior culture was still there. The swords were still sharp, and the raids still happened. But the context had shifted. A warrior might now pray to Saint Michael before battle rather than a war god. He might wear a cross around his neck next to his bear-toothed talisman. The frantic energy of the resistance against Rome had been sublimated into the slow, steady work of building a kingdom that was part of Christendom. By the end of the 7th century, the pagan Picts were essentially a memory. They were a Christian nation, at least nominally. They had bishops, they had monasteries, and they had access to the Bible. But they had achieved this without being conquered by a foreign army. They had taken the religion of Rome and made it Pictish. They carved the cross with their own intricate, swirling knotwork, binding the new faith into the old patterns of their soul. They didn't just swap gods, they wove Christ into the tapestry of the north, making him wear a tartan cloak and carry a spear against the darkness. By the late 7th century, the geopolitical map of Britain was being redrawn by a hungry new power. The Angles of Northumbria, a Germanic kingdom based in what is now northern England, had become the bullies of the island. They weren't satisfied with just owning the lands south of the Tweed. They were pushing their way north, crossing the Forth, and establishing a hegemony over the southern Pictish territories. They installed puppet kings, collected tribute, and generally acted as if they owned the place. The Picts were being squeezed. The southern tribes had lived under the Anglian yoke for decades, and the resentment was boiling. The man sitting on the Northumbrian throne was King Ecgfrith. He was powerful, rich, and dangerously overconfident. He had already ravaged the Irish coast and defeated the Mercians. To him, the Picts were just another barbarian nuisance to be disciplined. But facing him in the north was a Pictish king of a different caliber, Bride mac Billy, also known as Bride III. Here is where history gets Shakespearean. Bride and Ecgfrith were cousins. They likely knew each other. This wasn't just a war between nations. It was a family feud written in blood. In the spring of 685 AD, Ecgfrith decided it was time to crush his cousin once and for all. He assembled a massive army, the finest cavalry and infantry in Britain, and marched north. His advisors, including the famous Saint Cuthbert, begged him not to go. They saw the omens, they felt the bad air. But Ecgfrith was deaf to warnings. He believed in the invincibility of his heavy cavalry. He marched his host past the Firth of Forth, burning duns and farmsteads as he went, trying to goad the Picts into a fight. But Bride mac Billy didn't take the bait. He knew he couldn't beat the Northumbrian heavy hitters in a fair fight on an open plain. So he chose not to fight fair. He employed the oldest trick in the Highland playbook, the feigned retreat. He let his scouts be seen. He let his rearguard skirmish and then run away. He dangled the carrot. He pulled Ecgfrith deeper and deeper into Pictish territory, further away from his supply lines, and crucially, into the terrain of Bride's choosing. The chase led the Northumbrian army into the heart of Angus, a landscape of rolling hills and treacherous wetlands. It was Saturday, the 20th of May, 685 AD. The weather, according to the chroniclers, was miserable. A cold wind blowing off the North Sea, likely driving a sea fog inland. The Northumbrians were tired, wet, and frustrated. They were marching through a narrow defile near a place called Don Nechtain, or Nechtansmere, likely the modern village of Dunnichen. To their right were the steep slopes of the hill. To their left was a sodden, impassable marsh known as the Pool of Heron. And then the trap snapped shut. Ecgfrith, leading his cavalry through the gap, suddenly found the retreating Picts turning around. But they weren't alone. From the wooded slopes of Dunnichen Hill, hundreds, perhaps thousands, of Pictish warriors emerged from the mist. They had been waiting there for days, lying in the heather, silent as stones. The Northumbrian column was instantly paralyzed. They couldn't deploy their cavalry. The ground was too boggy and the space was too tight. They were bottled up. The battle was less of a tactical maneuver and more of a massacre. The Pictish shield wall slammed into the confused Anglian ranks. The Northumbrians were hit from the front and the flank simultaneously. The horses panicked in the mud. The great strength of the Northumbrian army, its armored riders, became its weakness. Men were thrown into the mire, weighed down by mail, and drowned or speared before they could stand. King Ecgfrith, to his credit, didn't run. Realizing he had been outsmarted and that there was no escape, he gathered his personal bodyguard, his hearth troop, and charged into the thick of the fighting. He died there, cut down in the mud of a foreign field, surrounded by the flower of Northumbrian nobility. It was a total decapitation of the Anglian leadership. Meanwhile, far to the south in Carlisle, Saint Cuthbert was giving a tour of the Roman ruins to the Queen of Northumbria. Suddenly, he stopped, his face growing pale. He stared into the distance as if seeing something invisible and murmured, "I fear the war is over, and that judgment has been given against our people." It's a chilling anecdote that underscores the spiritual weight of the disaster. The shockwave of the defeat was instantaneous. The Battle of Dun Nechtyn is arguably the single most important event in the history of Scotland. If Ecgfrith had won, there would likely be no Scotland today. The whole island would have probably become a unified Anglian kingdom, an early England stretching from the Channel to the Orkneys. But Priday stopped them dead. He drew a line in the mud that the Angles never crossed again in force. The aftermath was brutal for the Northumbrians. The Venerable Bede, writing with a palpable sense of grief, recorded that, from that time, the hopes and strength of the English crown began to waver and retrograde. The Northumbrians who weren't killed were enslaved. The Pictish territory that had been under Anglian control was liberated instantly. The borders snapped back to the River Forth. The Anglian bishop, Trumwine, who had established a see at Abercorn to convert the Picts, fled in terror back to Whitby. For the Picts, it was a moment of supreme triumph. They had taken on the superpower of the age and annihilated it. They recovered their land, their people, and their pride. But more importantly, the victory at Dun Nechtyn solidified the Pictish nation. It proved that the Confederation worked. It proved that a Pictish High King could command a unified army and execute a complex strategic plan. Priday Mac Billy became a legend, the hammer of the Angles. We can see the legacy of this battle carved in stone. At the churchyard in Aberlemno, just a few miles from the battlefield, stands a magnificent cross slab known as Aberlemno II. On one side is a cross, intricate and holy. On the other side is a vivid narrative scene of a battle. It shows long-haired warriors with small round shields fighting helmeted warriors who look suspiciously like Northumbrians. In one corner, a figure is being pecked at by a raven, the symbol of death in battle. It is widely believed that this stone is a contemporary memorial to Dun Nechtyn, a piece of stone propaganda erected to say, "Remember this. Remember what happens when you come here uninvited." The battle also changed the cultural trajectory of the Picts. By expelling the Northumbrian churchmen, the Picts turned back towards the influence of the Irish Church for a time. It preserved the unique Celtic character of the North for another century or so. It ensured that when a unified kingdom eventually did emerge, it would be a Gaelic Pictish hybrid, not an Anglian one. But beyond the high politics, imagine the scene at the lochside that evening. The mist clearing to reveal heaps of bodies in the mud. The victorious Picts stripping the armor and weapons from the fallen. Swords and helmets that would become treasured heirlooms for generations. The silence returning to the glen, broken only by the call of the herons who gave the pool its name. The king, Bridie, standing over the body of his cousin Ecgfrith, perhaps feeling a mix of triumph and the grim reality of kinship spilled. He ordered Ecgfrith to be buried on the holy island of Iona, a surprisingly respectful gesture. It was a nod to Ecgfrith's royal blood, but also a final power move, burying his enemy in the spiritual heartland of the Celtic world, far from his Northumbrian home. Dun Nectaine proved that the Picts were not just raiders or savages hiding in the woods. They were a formidable state with a military capacity that could rival anyone in Europe. They had defended their existence in the most definitive way possible. The ghosts of the North had become the guardians of the North, and for the next 150 years, the English kept a very respectful distance. The border between us and them had been inked in blood, and it held. If you were to walk into the great hall of a Pictish fortress, let's say the rocky citadel of Dundurn, and ask the assembled nobles to introduce themselves, you would notice something peculiar about their names. In almost every other medieval kingdom, from the Franks to the Saxons, power flowed down a straight, unwavering line from father to son. You had a king named Edward, and his son was Edward Jr., and his son was Edward III, and so on, until the gene pool got a bit murky. But in Pictland, the family tree wasn't an oak. It was a tangled bramble. If you look at the Pictish king lists, the documents that record the rulers of the North, you will find a glaring omission. For centuries, hardly a single Pictish king was succeeded by his own son. This brings us to the most controversial, debated, and frankly fascinating aspect of Pictish society: the theory of matrilineal succession. It's an idea that makes the Picts unique in the landscape of Dark Age Europe, a cultural quirk that suggests their society was operating on a completely different operating system than their neighbors. The theory, in its simplest form, is this: you didn't become king of the Picts because your father was the king. You became king because your mother was royal. The primary source for this claim is our old friend, the Venerable Bede. Writing in the early 8th century, Bede recounts the origin myth of the Picts. He says that when they first arrived in Britain from Scythia, a legendary geography, not a real one, they had no women. So they asked the Irish, the Scots, for wives. The Irish agreed, but with a strict prenup, that when any difficulty should arise, they should choose a king from the female royal line rather than the male. Bede then adds, crucially, which custom, as is well known, has been observed among the Picts to this day. To this day. That is a very strong statement from a man who was usually careful with his facts. It implies that even in the 700s, the Northumbrians looked at their northern neighbors and thought, those guys have a really weird way of picking a boss. If this system was real, here is how it likely worked. The royal bloodline, the right to rule, was carried exclusively by the women. A king could not pass his crown to his son because his son was only related to the royal line through the father, which didn't count. Instead, the crown would pass to the king's brother, his mother's son, or to his nephew, his sister's son. In this Game of Thrones, the king's sister was the most important person on the chessboard. Her womb was the factory of future kings. This system, if it existed, had a brilliant, cynical logic to it. In a world before DNA testing, paternity was always a matter of opinion. As the old saying goes, mommy's baby, daddy's maybe. By tracing descent through the mother, you removed all doubt. You knew exactly whose blood flowed in the veins of the heir. It ensured that the royal line remained pure, regardless of who the father was. And this leads to the most striking piece of evidence supporting the theory. The fathers of Pictish kings were often foreigners. This is the exogamy argument. Because the royal women carried the sovereignty, they could be married off to powerful princes from other kingdoms, Britons, Angles, Scots, to seal alliances. Their sons would then be raised as Picts and eventually become kings. Look at the roll call of the great Pictish monarchs. Talorgan mac Eanfrith, king in the 650s, was the son of Eanfrith, a Northumbrian prince who had lived in exile among the Picts. Bride mac Billy, the victor of Dun Nechtain, was the son of Billy, a king of the British kingdom of Strathclyde. Under a patrilineal system, these men would have been Northumbrian or British, but in Pictland, they were fully Pictish kings. Their foreignness didn't matter because their mothers were Pictish princesses. It turned the Pictish court into a cosmopolitan melting pot, a place where the king might speak Gaelic or Old English with his father, but ruled in Pictish. It explains why the Picts were so hard to conquer. You couldn't just marry your son to a Pictish princess and expect your grandson to inherit the kingdom as a client state. If you married a Pictish princess, your son didn't belong to your dynasty anymore. He belonged to hers. The Pictish matrilineal blob absorbed everything it touched. It was a genetic defense mechanism. However, we need to pause and put on our skepticism hats, because modern historians love to ruin a good story. In recent decades, there has been a pushback against the matrilineal theory. Some scholars argue that Bede was just repeating a myth, a just-so story invented to explain why Pictish kings had different fathers. They argue that what looks like matrilineal succession might just be tanistry, a Celtic system where the crown passes between brothers and cousins within a wider extended family, the derb fine, rather than straight to a son. In a violent society, grown men make better kings than children. If a king died leaving a 5-year-old son, the tribe wouldn't wait for him to grow up. They would pick the king's adult brother. Over time, this could look like matrilineal succession without actually being codified law. But the counter-argument to the skeptics is the sheer statistical anomaly of the king lists. For a period of hundreds of years, we have dozens of kings, and until the very end of the Pictish period, we have almost 0 instances of a son directly succeeding his father. That is statistically bizarre. Even with tanistry, you would expect some strong king to eventually shove his son onto the throne. The fact that it didn't happen suggests there was a powerful cultural taboo against it. If the system was matrilineal, it places the royal women of the Picts in a fascinating light. We don't know their names. The king lists are a sausage fest. They record the men who held the sword, but the women are the ghosts in the machine. Imagine the power of a Pictish matriarch. She is the daughter of a king, the sister of a king, and the mother of a king. She is the nexus of power. She would have been treated with immense reverence, guarded like a national treasure. Her marriage bed was a matter of state security. This might also explain the mysterious symbols on the stones again, specifically the mirror and comb. This symbol appears frequently, often in prominent positions. For a long time, Victorian antiquarians dismissed it as a symbol of female vanity, as if a Pictish queen wanted to be remembered for her hair care routine. But in this context, the mirror and comb might be symbols of status and lineage. They might represent the keepers of the blood. A stone with a mirror and comb next to a wolf might be saying, "This land belongs to the wolf clan, through the line of the queen." There is a tragic element to this system as well. If you were a Pictish king, your own son, the boy you bounced on your knee and taught to hunt, could never be king. He was a nobleman, sure, but he was a dead end. Your heir was your sister's son, a boy raised in another household, perhaps even by a different father. It must have created a strange emotional distance in the royal families. The bond between uncle and nephew, the avunculus relationship, was likely stronger than the bond between father and son. It also meant that the Pictish throne was never securely held by one single family. Power constantly circulated. One generation, the king is the son of a Strathclyde prince. The next, he is the son of a local Anglian warlord. The next, he is the son of a minor Pictish chieftain. This prevented any one dynasty from getting too comfortable or too tyrannical. It kept the aristocracy on their toes. Every time a king died, the deck was reshuffled. This fluidity might be why the Picts were so prone to internal conflict. If every nephew of a former king had a claim, you could end up with 6 or 7 valid candidates for the throne at any one time. The king lists are full of short reigns, 1 year, 2 years, sometimes just a few months. These were likely the losers in the succession wars. Trust ruled for 1 year is historian code for trust tried, failed, and was probably thrown into a bog. But as the centuries wore on, the pressure to conform to the rest of Europe grew. The Church, with its Roman ideas of patriarchy and primogeniture, father to son inheritance, didn't like this matrilineal weirdness. It felt unnatural to them. They wanted a nice, orderly line of begats, and as the Pictish kings became more Christianized, they likely started to look at their neighbors in Northumbria and Dal Riata with envy. They wanted to leave their kingdoms to their own sons. They wanted to build a dynasty that bore their name. By the late 8th and 9th centuries, the cracks in the matrilineal system, if it existed, were starting to show. We start to see kings trying to position their sons for power. The old taboo was fading. The foreign fathers were becoming less common. The Pictish anomaly was slowly being smoothed out by the iron of political ambition. Yet, for the golden age of the Picts, the age of the great symbol stones and the defiance of Rome, this system was their secret weapon. It allowed them to absorb the strength of their neighbors without losing their identity. It made them a nation of mothers' sons. It suggests a society where the feminine principle was the bedrock of sovereignty, a hidden foundation upon which the male warriors stood. So, when we look back at the shadowy figures of Bride, Nectan, and Talorgan, we have to remember the silent women standing behind them. the queens without names who held the map of the future in their blood. The Pictish state was a tapestry woven by men, but the loom was held by women. And perhaps, in the end, that is why they remain so elusive. They didn't follow the rules of history that we expect. They played a different game, and they played it better than anyone gave them credit for. In the summer of 1958, a schoolboy named Douglas Coutts was helping archaeologists excavate a ruined medieval chapel on a small, wind-battered tombolo known as St. Ninian's Isle in Shetland. It was the sort of tedious, muddy work that usually results in a few rusty nails or a fragment of pottery. But Douglas lifted a slab of stone marked with a faint cross and found something that would rewrite the history books. Beneath the slab was a rotting wooden box, and inside that box was a tangle of dull, green-stained metal. It wasn't rusty iron, it was silver. 28 objects of breathtaking beauty that had been sleeping in the dark for over 1,000 years. The St. Ninian's Isle hoard is the Tutankhamun's tomb of Pictish studies. It is the single most important collection of Pictish metalwork ever found, and it shatters the Roman propaganda of the barbarian North once and for all. Barbarians don't make art like this. The hoard contained 12 penannular brooches, the kind with a long pin that swivels around a ring, 7 silver bowls, a spoon, a pommel from a sword, and bizarrely, the jawbone of a porpoise. This wasn't a pirate's loot. It was the portable wealth of a high-status Pictish family, or perhaps the treasury of a church, hastily hidden under the floorboards in a moment of sheer panic. To understand the Picts, you have to look closely at these objects. The craftsmanship is microscopic in its detail. The silversmiths who made these brooches were working without magnifying glasses, yet they created interlacing patterns so fine that the human eye struggles to follow them. This is the style known as horror vacui, a fear of empty space. Every millimeter of the surface is covered in swirling spirals, geometric knots, and stylized animal heads. It's a visual overload, a psychedelic celebration of complexity. One of the bowls is particularly telling. It's a hanging bowl, likely used for hand washing during a feast or a ritual. The inside is decorated with a mount that looks like a little hedgehog of silver and glass. But the silver itself tells a deeper story. There are no silver mines in Scotland. The Picts didn't pull this metal out of the ground. So, where did it come from? The answer is the ghost of Rome again. The Picts were the ultimate recyclers. They took the silver coins, the platters, and the statues left behind by the empire, or stolen in raids, and melted them down. They took the cold, imperial face of Caesar and hammered it into the warm, organic curves of Celtic art. It was an act of cultural appropriation in the most literal sense. They turned Roman currency into Pictish jewelry. But the St. Ninian's Isle hoard is just the tip of the iceberg. If you really want to feel the weight of Pictish power, you have to look at the silver chains. There are 10 of these massive chains surviving today, and all of them were found in Pictland. The most famous is the White Clooch chain. It weighs nearly 2 kilograms, over 4 pounds. It consists of huge, chunky double links of solid silver, ending in a penannular terminal engraved with Pictish symbols like the Z-rod. These weren't delicate necklaces for a lady. These were chokers for a giant. They were likely worn by kings or high chieftains, resting heavy on the collarbone, a physical manifestation of authority. Wearing 4 pounds of silver around your neck sends a very clear message. I am so rich, I can wear the equivalent of 100 cows. It's a display of surplus wealth that implies a stable, hierarchical society. You don't make items like this if you are struggling to survive. You make them when you have a surplus, when you have specialized artisans, and when you have a political structure that requires symbols of office. The existence of these chains also hints at the elusive kingdom of Fortriu. For a long time, historians thought the center of Pictish power was in the south, near Perth. But many of these high-status silver finds, including the St. Ninian's hoard and the chains, cluster in the north and northeast. It reinforces the idea that the true heart of the Pictish overlordship was often up in the Moray Firth area, the land of King Brede. This was the Gold Coast of the Iron Age North, or rather, the Silver Coast. Another spectacular find is the Norreys Law Hoard, discovered in Fife in 1819 by a shadowy figure, possibly a grave robber, who sadly melted down much of it before the authorities caught wind. What remains is exquisite. Silver plaques marked with the double disc and Z-rod, and delicate handpins. The presence of the symbols on the silver is crucial. It links the metalwork directly to the stone carvings. The same artists who designed the great cross slabs were likely designing the jewelry, or at least working from the same pattern books. The symbols weren't just religious icons. They were a branding exercise that permeated every level of elite society, from the rocks in the field to the brooch on the king's cloak. The technique used to create these masterpieces was sophisticated. They used lost wax casting, where a model is carved in wax, covered in clay, and then the wax is melted out to create a mold. They practiced gilding, applying a thin layer of gold to the silver to make it shine like the sun. They used niello, a black sulfurous paste rubbed into the engraved lines to create a stark, high-contrast black and silver effect. And they loved bling, insetting studs of amber, red glass, or polished stone to catch the firelight in the mead hall. But there is a dark shadow hanging over all these hoards. Why do we find them? We don't find them because the Picts wanted to leave them for us. We find them because the people who buried them never came back to get them. The St. Ninian's Isle hoard was buried in a pine box beneath a stone slab in a church. That is a specific kind of behavior. You don't bury your family fortune under the floor of the local chapel unless you are terrified. The dating of the hoard suggests it was deposited in the late 8th or early 9th century. This coincides perfectly with the arrival of the dragon ships. The Vikings were coming. The monks and the local lords, seeing the sails on the horizon, grabbed their most precious portable assets, rushed to the holiest place they knew, and prayed that the altar would protect their treasure, even if it couldn't protect their lives. In this light, the hoards are tragic time capsules. The white klooch chain might have been hidden in a bog by a king fleeing a lost battle. The Norreys Law silver was found in a sand mound, perhaps a hasty deposit by a chieftain hoping to return after the raiding season. Every hoard represents a disaster. It represents a break in the chain of ownership. The person who knew the secret spot died, killed by a Norse axe or a sudden fever. And the silver lay there, silent and cold, while the world above it changed. Yet, despite the tragedy of their concealment, these objects speak of a vibrant, colorful life. We have to imagine them not as museum pieces, but in motion. Picture the silver bowls filled with dark ale at a feast. Picture the heavy brooches pinning a tartan cloak against the wind, flashing in the winter sun. Picture the massive silver chains clinking softly as a king raised his arm to speak. The artistry also tells us about the Pictish mind. The interlaced patterns, the endless knotting lines with no beginning and no end, suggest a worldview deeply concerned with continuity, with the cyclical nature of life and death, and with the interconnectedness of all things. It is a Celtic philosophy rendered in metal. It is protective magic. A knot that cannot be untied traps the evil spirits. A serpent biting its own tail protects the wearer. These weren't just decorations, they were spiritual armor. So, when we look at the St. Ninian's Isle treasure, we are looking at the pinnacle of Pictish material culture. They had taken the Roman technology, the Irish artistic influences, and the Anglo-Saxon motifs, and blended them into something uniquely their own. They were rich, they were skilled, they were proud. But as the 8th century drew to a close, all the silver in the world couldn't buy them safety. The gleam of the silver was about to be eclipsed by the glare of fire. The horizon was darkening, and the age of the horde barriers was just beginning. In the tumultuous history of the North, where kings often flickered out like candles in a drafty hall, one man stands like a monolith of black basalt. His name was Ungus, son of Fergus. If Bridi MacBilly was the savior of the Picts, Ungus was their emperor. He didn't just defend the borders, he grabbed the entire map of Scotland by the scruff of the neck and shook it until it did exactly what he wanted. Ruling from 729 to 761 AD, he is the first figure in Scottish history who feels less like a tribal warlord and more like a true state builder, a man with a terrifying vision and the iron will to forge a single nation out of the chaos. Oengus didn't inherit the throne peacefully. He took it. The 720s were a decade of bloody civil war in Pictland, a Game of Thrones scenario with 4 different claimants vying for the high kingship. It was a messy, internecine struggle fought in the glens and on the lochs. But Oengus was simply better at violence than everyone else. In a series of decisive battles at Monid Grob, Moncrief Hill, and elsewhere, he systematically eliminated his rivals. He didn't just defeat them, he executed them. By 729 AD, the last pretender, a man named Drust, was killed, and Oengus stood alone at the summit of power. Once his internal enemies were buried, Oengus turned his gaze outward. His primary target was the kingdom of Delriata in the west, the home of the Scots. For centuries, the relationship between Picts and Scots had been a tit-for-tat exchange of raids. Oengus decided to end the conversation permanently. In the 730s, he launched a campaign of smiting, a favorite word of the chroniclers, that was shocking in its thoroughness. He didn't just raid cattle, he dismantled the Scotic state. The climax of this campaign came in 736 AD, when Oengus captured the impregnable fortress of Dunad. Dunad was the ritual heart of the Scots, the place where their kings were inaugurated by placing their foot in a stone footprint carved into the rock. Oengus stormed it. He likely burned the timber halls and, in a supreme act of dominance, he took the sons of the Scotic king and threw them into chains. The Irish annals record the smiting of Dal Riata with a grim finality. Oengus effectively conquered the Scots, ruling them as a subject people. For the first time, A single king controlled almost the entire landmass north of the Forth. But Hungus wasn't satisfied with just the north. He looked south to the Anglian kingdom of Northumbria. But unlike his predecessors, he didn't just fight them, he played 4D chess. He formed an alliance with the kingdom of Mercia, the rising power in the English Midlands. Together, the Picts and the Mercians squeezed Northumbria from both sides like a vice. It was a masterstroke of diplomacy. We have records of the Pictish army marching south to join the Mercians, a level of logistical coordination that proves Pictland was now a major European power. Under Oengus, the Pictish monarchy became heavier, more imperial. He wasn't just a primus inter pares, first among equals. He was an autocrat. We see this reflected in the art of the period. The St. Andrew's sarcophagus, one of the finest pieces of early medieval sculpture in Europe, dates from roughly this time or shortly after. It is a stone box carved with scenes of David the shepherd slaying the lion. But the face of David isn't a generic biblical figure. It is a portrait of a Pictish warrior king with long hair and flowing robes. It is art used as propaganda, linking the house of Oengus to the biblical kings of Israel. It says, "I am not just a warlord, I am God's anointed." It was also during his reign, or slightly later, in the mythologized version, that the cult of St. Andrew arrived in Scotland. The legend goes that a monk named Regulus, or Rule, brought the relics of the Apostle Andrew, specifically some finger bones and a tooth, from Greece to the Fife Coast. He landed at a place called Chenrigmanade, head of the King's Mount, which we now know as St. Andrews. Angus, seeing the potential in hosting the relics of an actual apostle, patronized the church there. This was a brilliant move. By adopting St. Andrew, the brother of St. Peter, Angus was essentially saying, "The Pope has Peter, but I have Andrew. My church is just as holy as Rome." It put Pictland on the spiritual map. The iron grip of Angus brought a generation of stability. The constant petty raiding between clans likely diminished because everyone was too afraid of the king to step out of line. He standardized the law. He likely taxed the trade routes. He created a surplus that allowed for the commissioning of the great Class II cross slabs. Huge, rectangular slabs of stone with a cross on one side and Pictish symbols on the other. These weren't just grave markers, they were state monuments. However, Oengus's ambition eventually hit a wall. In 750 AD, his army suffered a catastrophic defeat against the Britons of Strathclyde at the Battle of Mossitock. His brother Talorgan was killed. It was a check on his power, a reminder that even an Iron King can bleed. But he survived. He held onto the throne for another decade, dying peacefully in 761 AD, a rare feat for a man in his line of work. The obituary in the Irish annals is respectful, calling him a tyrant, but in the classical sense of a powerful, absolute ruler, not necessarily a cruel one. O Angus, I transformed the Picts from a loose confederation into a kingdom. He created the template for a unified Scotland. The tragedy is that his dynasty didn't last. The matrilineal system, or perhaps just the inherent volatility of Pictish politics, meant that after his death, the kingdom fractured again. But the memory of his reign remained. He had shown what was possible. He had shown that the North could be one. There is a fascinating theory that the sudden collapse of the Scotic kingdom of Dal Riata under Oengus is the reason why we speak English and not Gaelic in the lowlands today. Or rather, why the Pictish language eventually disappeared. The theory is that by smashing the Scotic nobility, Oengus inadvertently created a vacuum that would later be filled by a resurgent Gaelic culture when the Vikings arrived. But in the 8th century, it looked like the future was Pictish. Imagine the court of Oengus at Forteviot or St. Andrews. It would have been a place of high culture. Poets reciting lineages, monks illuminating gospels in the scriptorium, silversmiths hammering out brooches for the king's favorites. Ambassadors from Mercia and even Charlemagne's court might have visited, bringing wine and silk. It was the zenith of Pictish civilization. They had a king who was feared from the Orkneys to the English Channel. They had a church that held the bones of an apostle. They were, briefly, the center of gravity in the British Isles. But the wheel of fortune never stops turning. Oengus built a fortress of order, but he couldn't control the sea. While he was consolidating his empire, perfecting his administration, and carving his image into stone, the longships were being built in the fjords of Norway. The storm that would wash away his legacy was already gathering, just over the horizon. If the reign of Oengus was the iron skeleton of the Pictish nation, the art that flourished in its wake was the golden skin. We are now entering the era of the Class 2 stones, and the shift is dramatic. We have moved from the rough, jagged boulders of the hillside to the manicured, deliberate grandeur of the rectory garden. These are not merely stones. They are monuments. They are the stone books of the North, standing tall against the grey sky, proclaiming a new identity that is confident, Christian, and unapologetically Pictish. The difference between a Class 1 and a Class 2 stone is like the difference between a sketch on a napkin and an oil painting in a frame. Class Y stones were unhewn, with symbols incised into the surface. Class 2 stones are shaped. They are rectangular slabs, carefully dressed by masons to have smooth, flat faces. And crucially, they are carved in relief. The background is cut away, making the images pop out in 3D. This requires a completely different level of skill, time, and patronage. You don't make a Class 2 stone in an afternoon. You need a team of professional sculptors working for months, supported by a wealthy patron, a king, a bishop, or a mormaer, a great earl. The most striking feature of these stones is the dominance of the cross. On one side of the slab, the entire surface is usually given over to a massive, ornate cross, filled with the most mind-bendingly complex interlace patterns imaginable. These knots, endless loops of stone that weave over and under, were likely painted in vivid colors: reds, yellows, blacks, and blues. We see them today as somber gray ghosts, but in the 8th century, they would have been gaudy, psychedelic beacons visible from a mile away. But turn the stone over, or look to the sides of the cross, and the old world is still there. The Pictish symbols, the double disc, the crescent, the beast, haven't been banished. They have been integrated. They sit alongside the Christian iconography, often appearing just as large and as important. It is a visual concordat. The cross saves the soul, but the symbols define the rank and the tribe. It's a statement that says, we are Christians, yes, but we are Pictish Christians. Our ancient lineage supports the new faith. Take the Hilton of Cadboll Stone, discovered in Easter Ross. It is arguably the most elegant of them all. On the secular side, we don't just see abstract symbols, we see a snapshot of aristocratic life. There is a hunting scene, riders on horseback, spears poised, dogs chasing a deer, and in the center, there is a figure that stops you in your tracks, a woman riding side saddle. She wears a large brooch and is accompanied by a mirror and comb symbol. This isn't a saint. This is a queen, or perhaps a high-born abbess. She is celebrated in stone, immortalized in the act of the hunt, which was the sport of kings. It's a rare and beautiful glimpse into the gender dynamics of the elite. She is central, she is powerful, and she is calm amidst the chase. Then there is the Nick stone, a masterpiece that pushes the very limits of what sandstone can do. The carving is so fine, so intricate, that it looks less like stone and more like a page from the Book of Kells that has petrified. In fact, art historians believe the sculptors and the manuscript illuminators were looking at the same pattern books. The Nick stone features David, the biblical king, renting the jaws of a lion. This imagery of David appears repeatedly on Pictish sculpture of this period. Why David? Because David was the perfect role model for a Pictish warlord. He was a shepherd, pastoral, a warrior, military, a poet, musical, and a king chosen by God. By carving David, the Picts were projecting their own self-image. They were saying, "Our king is the new David. He protects the flock and slays the monsters." This golden age of sculpture also reveals a society that was connected to the wider world. We see motifs that are clearly influenced by Northumbrian art, by Irish art, and even by distant Coptic or Byzantine styles. There are centaurs, griffins, and camels carved onto Scottish stones. A camel. How did a Pictish mason in the drizzle of Angus know what a camel looked like? Perhaps he saw a drawing in a visiting monk's Bible, or perhaps the trade routes really did stretch that far. It shatters the idea of isolation. These people were cosmopolitans living at the edge of the map. The function of these stones was likely multifaceted. They were preaching crosses, certainly, places where the community gathered to hear the word of God before churches were common. But they were also legal documents. In a world without land registries, a massive stone slab carved with your family symbols and the cross was the ultimate title deed. It said, "This land is held by the family of the Virod, under the protection of Christ and the King. To move it or deface it would be a crime against both the state and heaven." However, as we move through the Class 32 period, we can sense a subtle shift in the balance of power. The symbols, while still present, start to get smaller. They move from the center of the stone to the margins. On the earlier stones, the symbols are giant. On the later ones, they are tucked away at the bottom or the side. It suggests a slow fading of the old heraldic system. The universal power of the church was gradually eclipsing the tribal identity of the symbols. The Pict was slowly becoming just a Christian. There is also a tragic fragility to these monuments. The level of investment required to create them implies a society that thought it would last forever. They were built for eternity. The masons who chipped away at the Nig stone for years must have believed that their work would be admired by their grandchildren's grandchildren in a world that remained fundamentally the same. They couldn't know that the cultural context that made the symbols readable was about to be wiped out. This era represents the high summer of Pictish civilization, the fusion of the crescent and V-rod with the cross of Christ created an art style that was unique in Europe. It wasn't a clash of cultures, it was a marriage. The ferocity of the Pictish warrior spirit was channeled into the ferocity of the artistic detail. The biting beasts, the tangled snakes, the grim-faced horsemen. It was an aesthetic of controlled chaos, of wild energy bound by strict geometric laws. But shadows were lengthening. The very wealth that allowed these stones to be created, the silver, the church treasuries, the organized tax systems, was exactly what attracted the attention of the wolves across the sea. The Nick stone, for all its beauty, could not stop an axe. The golden age was glorious, but it was essentially a beautiful flower blooming on the edge of a cliff. The artists were carving their masterpieces while the horizon was turning black. The silence of the stone was about to be broken by the sound of splintering wood and foreign tongues. The end of the world began with a change in the wind. For centuries, the North Sea had been a barrier, a grey, heaving wall that protected the eastern flank of the Pictish kingdom. It was a highway for trade, certainly, and for the occasional currach of an Irish monk. But it was not a source of existential dread. The Picts looked south for their enemies, towards the hill forts of the Angles or the Britons. They built their great monasteries on the edge of the cliffs, at Port Mahomac, at majestic Iona, just off the coast of their Scotic neighbors, and on the islands of the north, believing that the ocean itself was a moat dug by God. They were wrong. In the final decade of the 8th century, specifically around 793 and 794 AD, the horizon stopped being empty. Fishermen tending their nets off the coast of Orkney or the Tarbat Peninsula would have looked up to see a sight that made no sense. Ships that moved against the wind. These weren't the round, skin-covered boats of the Celts. They were long, sleek slivers of oak, low in the water, propelled by banks of oars that moved with the rhythmic, terrifying precision of a heartbeat. They had square sails, striped in red and white, and prows carved into the shapes of dragons and serpents. Shutterstock. The Vikings had arrived. To the monks working in the scriptorium at Port Mahomac, the arrival of these ships must have felt like the apocalypse. We have to remember the psychological context. The Pictish churchmen believed in a universe governed by divine order. If you prayed, fasted, and created beautiful art for the glory of God, you were protected. The saints watched over you. But the men leaping from the shallow draft longships into the surf didn't care about the saints. They didn't fear the curse of Saint Columba or the wrath of Saint Peter. They were pagans, worshippers of Odin and Thor, and they saw the monasteries not as holy sanctuaries, but as undefended banks. The archaeology of Port Mahomac gives us a forensic snapshot of the horror that unfolded. This site, once a beacon of learning and art, was subjected to a violence that was total and systematic. Archaeologists have found a layer of ash, the burn layer, dating to this period. The great timber halls and the church were torched. But it wasn't just arson. The raiders went out of their way to smash the stone crosses. We have found fragments of the beautiful sculpture, the faces of angels and apostles shattered into hundreds of pieces and scattered across the site. This was iconoclasm. It was a statement. Your gods have no power here. The most chilling discovery at Port Mahomac was the skeletal remains found in the destruction layer. 2 men, likely monks or lay brothers, were found cut down by sword blows. One had been struck across the face with a blade so sharp it sliced through his jaw and teeth. This wasn't a battle. It was a slaughter. The monks were unarmed. They likely huddled around the altar, clutching their silver chalices and jeweled gospel books, waiting for a miracle that never came. The Vikings simply butchered them, stripped the gold from the covers of the books, threw the holy pages into the mud, and laughed. The impact of these initial raids was cataclysmic. In 793, the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle records the attack on Lindisfarne, just south of Pictland, noting that heathen men made lamentable havoc. In 794, the annals say the ravaging of the heathens occurred in Britain. In 795, Iona was attacked. The speed of the Viking expansion was terrifying. Their ships were technological marvels, light enough to be carried over land, shallow enough to sail up rivers, yet strong enough to cross the open ocean. They allowed the Norsemen to strike anywhere, anytime. They could land, burn a village, seize the cattle and the young women, and be back at sea before the local Mormire could even put on his helmet. For the Picts, this was an alien form of warfare. They were used to the heroic warfare of the Iron Age, cattle raids, scheduled battles at meeting places, and the taking of hostages for ransom. There were rules. You didn't usually burn down the sacred library. The Vikings broke the rules. They didn't want land at first. They wanted portable wealth and slaves. The slave markets of Dublin and Scandinavia were hungry for human chattel. And the Picts, with their healthy, well-fed population, were prime product. The geography of Pictland, once its greatest strength, became its greatest weakness. The long, indented coastline with its deep firths, the Moray Firth, the Cromarty Firth, the Firth of Tay, acted as funnels, guiding the longships deep into the heart of the kingdom. The island archipelagos of Orkney and Shetland, which had been Pictish strongholds for centuries, were the first to fall. We don't know exactly what happened there because the silence is absolute. One day, they were Pictish. A generation later, they were entirely Norse. The Pictish language, culture, and place names in the Northern Isles were wiped out almost completely. It suggests a process of ethnic cleansing or total assimilation that is chilling to contemplate. The ghosts of the Northern Picts simply vanished into the maw of the Norse language. This crisis forced a dramatic shift in Pictish strategy. The Golden Age centers of power in the north were now in the kill zone. A king could no longer sit safely in a coastal fort in Moray. The center of gravity of the kingdom began to shift southwards, towards the natural fortress of the Central Highlands and the defensible line of the River Tay. Fort Eviot and Scone became the new hearts of the realm, pulled back from the dangerous coast like a hand recoiling from a fire. The raids also militarized the church. The monks realized they couldn't just pray the Vikings away. We start to see round towers, similar to the ones in Ireland, appearing in Scotland, like the one at Abernethy, though likely later. These were defensive structures, stone silos, where the monks could retreat with their treasures and pull up the ladder. The church had to become a fortress. The peace of God had been shattered by the axe of the Northmen. But we must also imagine the confusion. Who were these people? To the Picts, the Vikings were Gentiles, heathens, or Galgedil, foreign Gaels. They were a punishment sent by God for the sins of the people. This was the common explanation in the medieval mind. If the pagans are winning, it must be because we aren't Christian enough. This led to a wave of soul-searching and perhaps a deepening of religious fervor. The relic cults became even more important. If you carried the bones of St. Andrew into battle, maybe he would deflect the Viking arrows. The sheer unpredictability of the Viking threat was its most potent weapon. A Pictish farmer in Fife could wake up on a Tuesday morning to find a fleet of dragon ships beached on the sand, and his world ending before breakfast. There was no warning system fast enough. The smoke of the burning monastery down the coast was usually the only signal you got. By the early 800s, the raids were evolving. The Vikings were no longer just hitting and running. They were wintering over. They were setting up bases. They were testing the defenses of the Pictish state, probing for weakness. They found that while the Picts were tough fighters on land, they had no navy that could challenge the longships at sea. The Picts were landlocked in their own country, watching the horizon with a permanent sense of dread. The arrival of the Vikings closed the book on the classical Pictish era. The time of leisurely carving intricate stones and debating theology was over. The time of survival had begun. The pressure was immense. It was a crucible that would melt down the old tribal structures. The Picts needed a savior, a warrior who could unite them against this existential threat. They would get their wish, but the price of unity would be the destruction of their ancient aristocracy. The dragon ships were not just bringing fire, they were bringing the end of an age. The ghosts on the shore were no longer the ancestors. They were the terrifying living nightmares from across the sea, and they were hungry. If history is a river, sometimes it flows gently, and sometimes it goes over a waterfall. The year 839 AD was the waterfall. Until this point, the Picts had been managing the Viking problem. They had fought them on the beaches, rebuilt the burned monasteries, and likely paid some heavy Danegeld, protection money, to keep the raiders at bay. They had treated the Norsemen as a severe weather event, something you endured until it passed. But in 839, the storm didn't pass. It stopped directly overhead and unleashed a deluge of violence that washed away the old world completely. The entry in the annals of Ulster for this year is terrifyingly brief, but it carries the weight of a tombstone. It reads, "The heathens won a battle against the men of Fortriu, and Giogan, son of Oengus, Bran, son of Oengus, Aed, son of Boanta, and others almost without number were killed there." Read that again. Others almost without number. This wasn't a skirmish. This was the catastrophic decapitation of the Pictish nation. To understand why this battle was so devastating, we have to look at who was on the field. The king, Uwen or Eogan, son of Oengus II, was there. He was the High King, the man holding the confederation together. His brother, Bran, was there, likely his designated heir or Tanist. And crucially, Aed mac Boanta, the king of the Scots of Dalriata, was also there. This implies a massive joint operation. The Picts and the Scots, often enemies, had united in the face of the existential threat. They had gathered the entire warrior aristocracy of the north, the Mormers, the Toyseks, the champions, the veterans of 100 cattle raids, and stood shoulder to shoulder to stop the Viking invasion force. We don't know exactly where the battle took place. The annals say Fortriu, which usually refers to the Pictish heartland in Moray and Strathearn. It might have been in the fertile valley of the Erne, or perhaps further north near the shores of the Moray Firth, where the longships would have landed. But we can reconstruct the horror of the day. The Vikings were no longer fighting as scattered bands of pirates. They were a great heathen army, in all but name, fighting with a ferocity and a tactical cohesion that the Picts had never seen. They used the shield wall, yes, but they also used the svinfylking, the boar snout, a wedge formation designed to smash through enemy lines like a battering ram. Picture the scene. The Pictish host, resplendent in their tattoos and their square shields, perhaps carrying the reliquary of Saint Columba or the bones of Saint Andrew at the front for divine protection. They clash with the Norsemen in a grinding, bloody shove. The air is filled with the screams of men and the splintering of ash-wood spears. But something goes wrong. The line breaks. The boar snout punches through. And then the slaughter begins. In the chaos, the king falls. His brother falls. The king of the Scots falls. When the leaders die in early medieval warfare, the army usually dissolves. It becomes a rout. The others without number were the nobility of Pictland being hunted down in the mud. These were the men who knew the laws, who owned the land, who patronized the church, and who remembered the genealogies. In a single afternoon, the institutional memory of the Pictish kingdom was wiped out. This event is often called the Red Wedding of Pictish history, but on a national scale. The death of Owen and Bran meant the end of the House of Oengus, the dominant dynasty that had provided stability for decades. But more importantly, the sheer scale of the casualties broke the mechanism of Pictish succession. Remember the complex, potentially matrilineal system we talked about. It relied on having a pool of eligible adult males, nephews, cousins, brothers, to choose from. But what happens when you kill them all? What happens when the brothers, the nephews, and the cousins are all lying dead in a heap on the battlefield? The system jammed. There was no one left to take the reins. The resulting power vacuum was absolute. It was a year zero. For the survivors, the psychological impact must have been shattering. God had clearly abandoned them. The joint army of the North, blessed by the church and led by the anointed kings, had been annihilated by pagans. It provoked a crisis of faith and identity. The old symbols, the V-rod, the crescent, the beasts, which had been fading anyway, likely lost their last shreds of power. What good is a protective snake symbol if a Viking axe can cleave right through it? The disaster of 839 also fundamentally changed the relationship between the Picts and the Scots. Before this battle, the Picts were undoubtedly the senior partners. They were the dominant power. Dal Riata was a client state. But the slaughter leveled the playing field in the grisliest way possible. Both royal houses were decimated. The survivors were forced together, not just by alliance, but by desperate necessity. The distinctions between Pict and Scot began to blur even faster if you were standing in the shield wall next to a Scot, and you both died fighting the same heathen. The old tribal differences seemed trivial. In the immediate aftermath, the kingdom descended into chaos. We see a flurry of short-lived kings in the lists, names like Urad and Pred, who ruled for 1 year or 2. These were likely local warlords trying to hold on to fragments of the shattering state, fighting the Vikings with one hand and each other with the other. The central authority of Fortriu was gone. The tax collectors stopped coming. The laws were unenforceable. The wolves, both literal and metaphorical, were coming out of the woods. But nature abhors a vacuum, and so does history. The destruction of the old elite created an opportunity for a new kind of leader, someone who wasn't bound by the old rules. someone ruthless enough to survive in the wreckage. The massacre of 839 cleared the board. It removed the entrenched interests that would have blocked a radical takeover. It was a tragedy, yes, a wound that bled the Pictish nation white, but it was also a clearing of the forest. The old oaks had been felled, leaving space for a new, vigorous sapling to grow, a sapling that would have its roots in both the Pictish and Gaelic worlds. As the smoke drifted over the battlefield of 839, the silence that fell was the silence of the end. The intricate, silver-adorned, symbol-carved world of the Picts had been smashed. The survivors retreated to their hill forts, barring the gates, waiting for the next blow. They didn't know that the next blow wouldn't come from the Vikings, but from the west. They didn't know that the man who would finally save them, and in doing so, erase them, was already making his move. The stage was set for the last act. In the smoking ruins left by the disaster of 839, a new figure stepped out of the shadows, and to this day, historians can't quite decide if he was a hero, a villain, or simply the most competent survivor in a room full of corpses. His name was Syned MacAlpin, or as he is better known to history, Kenneth MacAlpin. If the Vikings were the sledgehammer that shattered the Pictish state, Kenneth was the man who swept up the pieces and glued them back together into a shape that suited him personally. He is often celebrated as the first king of Scotland, the father of the nation. But the story of how he got there is less of a fairy tale and more of a noir thriller involving betrayed trust, political maneuvering, and, according to legend, a very deadly dinner party. Kenneth was a creature of the frontier, likely born of a mixed marriage, a Gaelic father from the royal line of Dalriata, and a Pictish mother from the royal line of Fortriu. In the old world, this dual heritage might have made him an outsider, trusted by neither side. But in the chaos of the mid-9th century, it made him the ultimate hybrid weapon. He could speak Gaelic to the Scots and Pictish to the men of the East. He had a claim to both thrones, and most importantly, he had an army of Scots who were desperate for land and security, and a Pictish population that was leaderless and terrified. The transition of power from the Picts to the Scots is shrouded in mystery. The contemporary chronicles are frustratingly vague, simply stating that Kenneth held the kingdom for 16 years after destroying the Picts. But how does one man destroy a nation that had beaten Rome? The medieval storytellers, writing centuries later, felt that a simple political coup was too boring. They needed a dramatic explanation for how the Pictish nobility vanished so completely. And so, they gave us the treachery of Scone. The story goes like this. It is around the year 843 AD. Kenneth, realizing he cannot conquer the remaining Pictish warlords by force alone, invites them to a great peace conference at Scone. Scone was the ancient, sacred assembly place of the Picts, the hill of credulity, where laws were made and kings were acclaimed. To invite them, there was a gesture of respect, a signal that he intended to rule according to their traditions. The Pictish nobles, perhaps wary but desperate for stability, arrived in their finest cloaks, expecting negotiations and a feast. The banquet was held in a great timber hall. The wine flowed freely, the roasted meats were piled high. Kenneth played the gracious host, toasting the unity of the two peoples. But the hall had been rigged. The benches on which the Pictish nobles sat were not ordinary furniture. They were placed over hidden pits dug into the earthen floor and held in place by wooden bolts or pins that could be removed by pulling a single string. At a prearranged signal, perhaps when Kenneth rose to give a speech or when the drummers began to play, the Scotic conspirators pulled the pins. The benches collapsed. The Pictish nobility tumbled backward into the pits, their legs trapped, their bodies confused and helpless in the sudden darkness. Before they could scramble out, the Scots drew their daggers and slaughtered them where they lay. It was a red wedding executed with industrial efficiency. In one night of alcohol and assassination, the entire remaining leadership of the Pictish resistance was liquidated. Now, did this actually happen? Probably not in the cartoonish trapdoor way described by later chroniclers like Giraldus Cambrensis. It reads too much like folklore. But myths usually grow from a seed of truth. It is highly likely that Kenneth eliminated his rivals through violence and treachery. He may have assassinated the remaining claimants, Trust X and others, at a parley or a feast. In the brutal politics of the Dark Ages, removing the competition was standard operating procedure. The treachery of Scone is a metaphor for a hostile takeover that was swift, bloody, and absolute. However, Kenneth was smart enough to know that you can't build a kingdom on murder alone. You need symbols. You need legitimacy. Once the rivals were dead, Kenneth embarked on a brilliant campaign of cultural appropriation. He didn't try to turn Pictland into a new island. He realized that the Pictish brand was still powerful. So he moved the religious center of his new kingdom from Iona, which was too vulnerable to Viking raids, to Dunkeld, deep in the heart of Pictish territory. He brought the relics of St. Columba with him, physically planting the holiest object of the Scots into the soil of the Picts. It was a masterstroke. He was saying, I am bringing the saint to you. This is now the Holy Land. He also maintained Scone as the political capital by being inaugurated at Scone, likely sitting on the famous Stone of Destiny. He was stepping into the shoes of the ancient Pictish kings. The stone itself, a block of coarse red sandstone, is the ultimate silent witness to this transition. Legend says it was brought from Ireland or the Holy Land, but geologically, it is local sandstone from the Scone area. It was a Pictish stone. By sitting on it, Kenneth wasn't conquering the land. He was marrying it. He was becoming the Rex Pictorum, the king of the Picts, a title he used in official documents. This is the crucial nuance that is often missed. Kenneth didn't call his new kingdom Scotland. He called it Pictavia, or the Kingdom of the Picts. For a generation or two, the fiction was maintained. The laws were still the old laws. The church was still the old church. The people still farmed the same land. But the software was being updated. The language of the court was now Gaelic. The patronage went to Gaelic poets who sang the praises of the MacAlpin dynasty, not the old Pictish lineages. This process is known as Gaelicization. It wasn't an ethnic cleansing where the Picts were driven into the sea. It was a top-down cultural shift. If you wanted to get ahead in Kenneth's kingdom, if you wanted a job as a tax collector or a favorable marriage for your daughter, you learned Gaelic. You adopted the manners of the new elite. Slowly, over decades, being Pictish became a sign of being old-fashioned, rustic, or low status. Being Scot was the ticket to the future. We can see this shift in the place names. In the east of Scotland, we have Celtic names, Pictish, like Pitt. meaning a portion of land, as in Pitlochry, and Aber, meaning a river mouth, as in Aberdeen. But overlaid on top of them, we start to see Gaelic names like Bal, meaning a settlement, as in Balmoral. The map was being rewritten, one farm at a time. The Pit names survived because the peasants stayed put, but the Bal names appeared as the new Gaelic landlords moved in. Kenneth ruled for 16 years, a lifetime in those dangerous days. He spent much of it fighting. He raided the English in Northumbria 6 times, seizing land and burning Dunbar. He fought off the Vikings, keeping the core of his new kingdom intact even as the islands burned. He was a warrior king in the mold of Oengus, a man of iron will who refused to let the flame of the north go out. But there was a ghostly sorrow to his success. By saving the kingdom, he had to destroy its soul, the unique, strange, beautiful culture of the Picts, the culture of the symbols, the matrilineal succession, the painted skin, was being suffocated by the success of the MacAlpin hegemony. The symbol stones stopped being carved. The old meanings were forgotten. The V-rod and the double disc were no longer the badges of honor. They were just peculiar carvings on old rocks that the new Gaelic monks didn't understand. When Kenneth died in 858 AD, he died in his bed at his palace in Fontevio, allegedly from a fistula, a grim, painful end, but better than an axe. The annals of Ulster call him Rex Pictorum, King of the Picts. But he was the last man to truly hold that title with the old meaning. He left behind a dynasty that would rule Scotland for centuries. He left behind a unified nation that could stand against the Vikings and the English. But he also left behind a silence. The Pictish language, spoken for 1,000 years in the glens, began its long, slow fade into oblivion, replaced by the tongue of the stranger who had come to dinner and never left. History rarely ends with a period. It usually ends with an ellipsis. The story of the Picts does not have a final chapter where the hero rides off into the sunset or the villain is vanquished in a puff of smoke. Instead, it has a long, slow fade out, like a melody being played on a harp that is gradually carried away by the wind. By the 10th century, the violent trauma of the Viking Age and the ruthless consolidation of the MacAlpin dynasty had done their work. The kingdom of the Picts was still there on the maps of foreign geographers, but on the ground, the reality was dissolving like sugar in hot water. The final act of this disappearance can be pinned to a specific, somewhat bureaucratic moment in the year 906 AD. The king was Constantine II, Constantin Mac Iada, the grandson of Kenneth MacAlpin. He was a survivor, a man who had fought the Vikings to a standstill, and knew that the only way to survive was unity. He met with Bishop Kellach on the Hill of Belief, likely Scone, and swore to protect the laws and disciplines of the faith and the rights of the churches and the Gospels. It sounds like standard kingly boilerplate, but the significance lies in what wasn't said. There was no mention of Pictish law. There was no mention of Pictish customs. The covenant was made in a Gaelic context, between a Gaelic-speaking king and a Gaelic-speaking church. It is around this time that the title Rex Pictorum, King of the Picts, vanishes from the annals. In its place, a new title appears, Ri Alban, King of Alba. Alba was the Gaelic word for Britain, but it came to specifically mean the United Kingdom of Picts and Scots. The change in terminology was an obituary. The state was no longer defined by the painted people. It was defined by a new, hybrid identity. The Picts had been Albanized. They had been absorbed so completely that their name was no longer useful. The most haunting part of this transition is the death of the language. Languages don't usually die in battle. They die in the nursery. It happens when a Pictish mother decides that to give her child a future, she must teach him the language of the king, not the language of her ancestors. It happens when the local bard realizes that if he wants to get paid, he has to sing in Gaelic. Slowly, generation by generation, the Pete Celtic tongue of the north retreated. It moved from the court to the marketplace, from the marketplace to the farm, and from the farm to the fireside of the very old. We will never know who the last Pictish speaker was. Perhaps it was an old woman spinning wool in a glen in Aberdeenshire, muttering words for water or stone that her grandchildren couldn't understand. When she died, 1,000 years of oral history, poetry, and song died with her. The silence she left behind is absolute. We have no Pictish books. We have no translations. We have only the cryptic place names, the pits and abers, embedded in the map like fossils, and the inscrutable carvings on the rocks. And what of those stones? The great symbol stones, the Class Juan and Class 2 monuments, stopped being carved. The Class 3 stones that followed were purely Christian monuments, crosses and grave slabs without the Z-rods or the beasts. This suggests something profound. The code had been forgotten. The complex social and heraldic system that the symbols represented had collapsed. The new Gaelic aristocracy didn't care about the matrilineal lineage of the Viper clan. They cared about their own pedigrees. The symbols, once the most important signs in the landscape, became meaningless decorations, or worse, suspicious pagan marks to be feared. However, it is important to understand that the Picts themselves didn't go anywhere. There was no genocide. The farmers didn't stop farming. The fishermen didn't stop fishing. If you take a DNA test today and your family is from Fife, Tayside, or Aberdeenshire, there is a very high probability that you are a Pict. The genetic markers of the painted people are still the dominant DNA signature in eastern Scotland. They are the ghosts in the blood. They morphed into the Scots of the Middle Ages. The armies of William Wallace and Robert the Bruce were arguably composed of men who, a few centuries earlier, would have been painting their chests and fighting Romans. The ferocity remained. Only the name had changed. The legacy of the Picts is a paradox. They are the most invisible of peoples, yet they are everywhere. They shaped the Kingdom of Scotland. It was their resistance that stopped Rome. It was their resistance that stopped the Angles. Without the Pictish grit acting as a buffer, the history of the British Isles would have been completely different. They were the shield wall behind which the embryonic Scottish nation was able to grow. In the centuries that followed, the Picts became the stuff of legend. Medieval chroniclers, embarrassed by the gap in their history, invented wild stories about them. They claimed the Picts were a race of pygmies, or Pecks, who built the great stone towers and then vanished underground. They claimed they brewed a magical heather ale, the secret of which they refused to divulge even under torture. These folk tales were the final indignity, transforming a sophisticated, powerful maritime empire into a fairy tale of magical dwarves. But the stones remain. They are the anchors that hold the truth against the drifting tides of myth. Standing before the great slab at Aberlemno, or the Nick stone, you can still feel the pulse of their intellect. You see the mathematical precision of the spirals, the humor in the depiction of the animals, the devout faith in the cross. You see a people who loved beauty, who respected the land, and who were terrified of oblivion. They carved their identity into the hardest rock they could find because they knew, on some level, that everything else fades. As we reach the end of this journey, the mist is reclaiming the glens. The great hill forts at Birkhead and Craig Fadrig are now just grassy mounds, their vitrified walls buried under centuries of turf. The timber halls of Forteviot have rotted away to dust. The silver chains are behind glass in museums. The long ships of the Vikings have sailed away, and the Roman eagles are just rust in the earth. But listen closely to the wind in the heather. Look at the way the light hits the grey water of the Moray Firth. The landscape is still theirs. The pit names on the road signs are their footprints. The faces of the people in the local towns, the shape of a jaw, the set of the eyes, are the faces of the people who watched the legions march and refused to bow. The Picts didn't disappear. They just changed their clothes. They stepped out of the spotlight of history and into the audience, becoming the silent, sturdy foundation of the nation that bears their conqueror's name. They are the bedrock, and like the bedrock, they are mostly unseen, but they support everything that stands above them. So, tonight, as you drift off, think of them not as savages or ghosts, but as the guardians of the North. Think of the artist blowing on his hands to warm them before picking up his chisel to carve a perfect swirling wolf into the granite. Think of the mother teaching her daughter the names of the stars in a language we will never hear again. They are gone, but they are not lost. They are waiting in the stone, in the blood, and in the mist, reminding us that we are all just temporary travelers on a very old earth. Sleep well, my friends.